Hey guys, welcome to the channel. Sit back, relax, and keep one eye open, because tonight we're stepping into the dark corridors of American history. These are the faces that haunted headlines, the fugitives who slipped through law enforcement's grasp, and the legends the FBI helped create just by naming them. From gangsters in pinstripes to hackers in hoodies, every name on the most wanted list tells a story. Not just of crime, but of a country obsessed with catching its own reflection. So lock your doors and clear your conscience. Let's dive into 100 FBI's most wanted throughout history. It started with an idea as simple as it was theatrical. Put the most dangerous people in America on a list, make their faces impossible to ignore, and let the country itself help hunt them down. It was 1950, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation was still trying to shed its reputation as a shadowy bureaucracy. J. Edgar Hoover, a man who understood both power and publicity, wanted the public to see the Bureau not as an agency buried in paperwork, but as a guardian standing between ordinary citizens and chaos. The spark came from a newspaper feature. A reporter from the Washington Daily News had asked the FBI to describe its toughest guys. Hoover's staff compiled 10 profiles: robbers, killers, conmen, and the story became a sensation. The readers devoured it, cutting out the mugshots like baseball cards. Hoover saw what he needed: a new kind of theater, a running serial where crime was the villain, the Bureau the hero, and America the audience. Within months, the first official 10 most wanted fugitives list appeared, printed on post office walls, in magazines, and across the radio airwaves. The idea wasn't just about catching criminals, it was about control. By deciding who qualified as most wanted, the Bureau shaped the public's idea of evil. The early lists weren't filled with masterminds. They were filled with men whose faces told a story: scarred bank robbers, drifters with cold eyes, escape artists with nicknames that sounded like pulp fiction villains. Their crimes mattered, but their images mattered more. Hoover's photographers made sure every shadow was harsh, every angle menacing. Fear, packaged neatly in black and white. It worked. Within the first year, half the fugitives on the list were captured, often because someone recognized them from a newspaper or a post office wall. A waitress in Illinois spotted one man pouring coffee. A barber in Oregon noticed another under his razor. The system turned every citizen into an informant, every face in a crowd a potential lead. America had never seen anything like it: law enforcement as mass participation, justice as a national pastime. But there was another layer beneath the headlines. The list wasn't just about catching criminals, it was about defining what a criminal looked like. In a decade trembling under Cold War paranoia, the Bureau's posters mirrored the country's anxieties. Fugitives were portrayed not only as killers or thieves, but as threats to the American way of life. Some had stolen cars, others had stolen secrets. To Hoover, both were acts of treason. Crime, he told reporters, is communism's cousin. The faces on that first list read like an archive of post-war dread. There was Thomas Holden, a murderer whose photo carried the weary arrogance of a man who'd seen too much of both war and prison. There was William Nesbitt, a forger turned killer, whose capture months later was celebrated like the fall of a dictator. Newspapers called him Public Enemy Number 11, as though evil itself had an official ranking. Hoover loved that phrase. It made crime measurable, and by extension, conquerable. Behind the scenes, the list transformed the Bureau. Every field office competed for a slot, submitting case files with meticulous detail, hoping their fugitive would make the top 10. Agents suddenly had to think like storytellers, crafting villains compelling enough to deserve public attention. Hoover personally approved each entry, He wanted variety: a murderer, a robber, a spy, a fraud. The list, he said, should represent the complete picture of criminal America. But as the Bureau's power grew, so did the myth. Hollywood joined in, producing thrillers about agents chasing men on the run. Radio dramas opened with the familiar staccato rhythm, "Tonight's Most Wanted." The list had become both a bulletin and a brand. Every capture was a victory lap, proof that the system worked. Every fugitive who remained free kept the story alive. America, a nation built on the frontier myth, had found its modern outlaw. The irony, of course, was that some of those fugitives didn't even rank among the most violent criminals of their time. Many were repeat offenders, habitual escapees, or men who had embarrassed the Bureau by slipping through its fingers. To Hoover, embarrassment was unforgivable. Being on the list wasn't always about the crime. Sometimes it was about the narrative. The list became a mirror of the FBI's pride and paranoia alike. Public fascination fed on spectacle. People wrote letters to Hoover offering tips, theories, and even advice on how to make the posters more frightening. Kids collected FBI handouts like trading cards. Housewives claimed to have spotted fugitives in grocery stores. America wasn't just watching. It was performing its own obsession with danger and safety, the twin pillars of mid-century psychology. And beneath it all, Hoover smiled. He understood that in a democracy, power needed an audience. The 10 Most Wanted list made law enforcement visible, heroic, almost cinematic. It turned every capture into proof that the state was still in control of its borders, its morals, its identity. It was no coincidence that the FBI's greatest propaganda triumphs coincided with its darkest controversies: wiretapping activists, infiltrating unions, blacklisting dissenters. The list, with its sharp edges and bold headlines, was the Bureau's way of saying, "We protect you, even from what you don't see." By the end of the 1950s, the Most Wanted had become a national ritual. New fugitives were announced with the same excitement as film premieres. Magazines ran features titled "America's Most Dangerous Men." Agents traveled with portable printing presses to churn out wanted posters on the road. Even criminals began to measure their infamy by whether they made the list. To some, it was a badge of honor, a grotesque kind of celebrity. "I must be doing something right," one captured fugitive joked to reporters, "if I made Hoover's top 10. But in those early years, the idea still carried a certain innocence, a belief that evil could be catalogued, caught, and photographed. The decade that followed would test that belief brutally. As the 1960s unfolded, civil rights marches, assassinations, riots, the Bureau's notion of who was most wanted would shift from outlaws with guns to citizens with opinions. The posters would start to show new kinds of faces: activists, radicals, revolutionaries. The age of the lone bandit was ending. The age of ideology was coming. And somewhere in a locked office at FBI headquarters, J. Edgar Hoover would keep refining his list, one photograph at a time, turning a simple law enforcement tool into a mirror that reflected America's deepest fears back at itself. The first men to appear on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list weren't just fugitives. They were prototypes of a new American mythology. Their crimes varied, but their purpose in the Bureau's narrative was identical. They were the villains a restless nation needed. Each name became a chapter in the government's living story about order, fear, and the fragile comfort of believing someone was out there keeping the world stitched together. The public read those early wanted posters like serialized thrillers. Every update carried the same cliffhanger rhythm. Have they been caught? The moment of capture was the final scene. Handcuffs snapping shut, flashbulbs exploding, the smiling agents beside the man who'd been elevated to infamy. Hoover personally choreographed those photographs. He believed every arrest should be a performance. Justice, he once said, must not only be done, it must be seen. One of the Bureau's first major victories came with Gerhard Puff, a German-born robber whose spree through the Midwest ended in blood. In 1952, the FBI tracked him to a hotel in New York. When Puff opened fire, he killed an agent before dying himself in the hallway crossfire. Hoover made sure the public saw the lesson. The fugitive was punished, the agents were brave, and the Bureau's moral order remained unshaken. Newspapers printed the story like scripture. The caption beneath Puff's photo read, "Justice met him at the door." Then there was James Earl Ray, who appeared on the list in 1968 after assassinating Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His manhunt stretched across oceans and ideologies. Ray fled to London, carrying a false passport, moving like a ghost through a world newly lit by television. His capture at Heathrow Airport proved the list's global reach. The FBI had moved beyond post office walls. It now broadcast through the satellites of modern media. The most wanted list was no longer paper, it was signal. Every fugitive brought new innovation. When Leslie Rogger, a master bank robber who escaped from federal custody, made the list in the 1980s, the Bureau turned to the newest tool in its arsenal, the Internet. Rogger's digital wanted poster was one of the first to appear online, marking the FBI's cautious step into cyberspace. A man who had evaded analog justice was undone by digital exposure when a viewer in Guatemala recognized his face. Hoover would have approved technology in service of spectacle, but fame cuts both ways. The Bureau learned that visibility can create icons as much as it destroys them. Ted Bundy's appearance on the list in 1978 elevated him from regional killer to national obsession. The story of his escapes and manipulations became fuel for tabloids and talk shows. Bundy knew it too. He studied his own coverage, treating notoriety like currency. By the time the FBI caught him, the line between villain and celebrity had blurred beyond recognition. The public didn't just fear him, they followed him. Hoover's invention had birthed something the Bureau couldn't entirely control, the criminal as brand. The Bureau adapted, expanding its narrative to match the times. The 1990s brought Ramzi Youssef, mastermind of the first World Trade Center bombing, and Eric Rudolph, the Olympic Park bomber who vanished into the Appalachian wilderness. Each chase unfolded like serialized drama, press conferences, composite sketches, the inevitable promise of justice soon. When Rudolph was finally captured, ragged and bearded, living off roots in the woods, America didn't just cheer his arrest. It celebrated closure, the comfort of a story completed. Behind the scenes, though, agents understood that the list wasn't about 10 men. It was about continuity. No matter how many fugitives were caught, there would always be another waiting to take their place. The list's real power lay in its permanence. It told the public that evil was always being pursued, always one step away from being conquered. It kept the nation's anxiety organized. By the early 2000s, the list had become ritualized, its updates covered by cable news, its website bookmarked by millions. The names changed, but the formula didn't. Bank robbers became hackers, saboteurs became terrorists. The archetype stayed the same, the face of threat framed by the seal of authority. Yet even as the Bureau polished its image, cracks showed. In 2013, Whitey Bulger, the Boston mob boss who'd evaded capture for 16 years, was finally arrested. The story was supposed to be a triumph, but his decades of freedom, aided by FBI corruption, turned it into scandal. The Bureau had built a machine for storytelling, but it couldn't edit the parts that made it human: mistakes, bias, ambition. The Most Wanted list had created a myth of omniscience, but real justice was always messier than the poster implied. Over 70 years, more than 500 fugitives have appeared on the list. Some were monsters, some were tragic, a few were probably innocent. All became pieces of the same puzzle, the portrait of a country negotiating with its own darkness. The list became less about law enforcement and more about self-definition. What frightened America enough to print on a poster said as much about the era as any headline. In the 1950s, the villains were robbers and escape artists. In the 1970s, they were radicals. In the 1990s, they were drug lords and terrorists. In the 2020s, they are cybercriminals, data thieves, architects of invisible violence. The faces change, but the function remains: reflection. The Bureau points to the wanted man, and the nation sees itself: the ambition, the fear, the unending hunger to assign guilt and seek redemption. The first fugitive ever listed, Thomas Holden, was captured after a citizen recognized him from a newspaper photo. He lived long enough to see his story replayed on television decades later, his mugshot a fossil of another time. The Last Man added this year appeared not in print, but as an algorithmic profile, his digital face reconstructed by predictive software. Somewhere between those two arrests, one born of human instinct, the other of machine logic, the Most Wanted list became something beyond Hoover's imagination. It became the country's moral diary, written in crime and consequence. And so, every generation rewrites it: 10 names, 10 faces, 10 reflections of whatever terrifies the present moment most. The Bureau still updates the list with the same quiet ceremony, each new poster an echo of the first. Somewhere, in a post office or a glowing screen, someone pauses to look. The ritual continues. The Bureau doesn't need to say it aloud, but the message is still the same one Hoover whispered to the nation 70 years ago. We are watching, so you don't have to. But the truth, of course, is that everyone's still watching. The list may catch criminals, but it also catches us. The 1950s was supposed to be an age of safety. White picket fences, clean-cut smiles, the illusion that America had finally found peace. But beneath the surface of that picture-perfect decade, something was rotting. Crime had not vanished. It had simply gone underground, trading Tommy guns for briefcases, desert hideouts for highways. And when the FBI's Most Wanted list hit its stride, the nation discovered that its appetite for evil had only grown sharper. Every radio broadcast, every newspaper headline turned fugitives into folk tales. These weren't just men running from the law. They were the darker reflections of a society drunk on order. People wanted to believe the suburbs were safe, that justice was absolute. But to believe that, they needed monsters to chase. The Bureau supplied them generously. Names like William Francis Sutton, known as Slick Willie, graced the early lists. Sutton was a career bank robber whose charm almost eclipsed his crimes. He famously told reporters, "I rob banks because that's where the money is," a line that made him sound more philosopher than felon. When he was finally caught in Brooklyn after decades of escapes, people didn't hiss, they applauded. Even Hoover, who despised anything resembling admiration for criminals, couldn't completely drown out the applause. The line between villain and legend was already blurring. Then there was Harold Red Powers, an outlaw whose crimes were small but whose persona burned like gasoline. Powers wasn't a mastermind. He was a drifter who'd robbed liquor stores across 3 states. But his mugshot, red hair, wild and defiant, became a visual symbol of rebellion. The Bureau plastered it everywhere. For weeks, the country's imagination belonged to a man whose greatest weapon was attitude. He was captured by sheer accident. Someone recognized his laugh in a roadside diner. But by then, he'd already made the list immortal. Hoover's machine knew exactly what it was doing. Each fugitive was a story, and each story was a mirror. The public didn't want to see reality. They wanted to see drama. The Bureau's press division wanted posters with the rhythm of pulp novels. Armed and dangerous, prefers women and whiskey, has vowed never to be taken alive. It read like marketing copy for sin. The FBI wasn't just fighting crime, it was curating fear, and the media devoured it. Magazines like Life and Time turned the fugitives into recurring characters, their faces familiar as movie stars. Television followed soon after. News anchors recited their names with the same cadence as sports announcers calling scores. Each capture became a national event, each escape a ratings spike. The public's obsession reached its fever pitch with George Leonidas Leslie, nicknamed the Gentleman Bandit. He was dapper, articulate, even courteous during his robberies, always insisting no one be harmed. When Leslie made the most wanted list, letters poured into the FBI asking for updates. Women wrote to him through newspapers, offering prayers, sympathy, sometimes proposals. When he was finally killed in a shootout, newsreels described it like the tragic end of a movie hero. America's favorite outlaw dies in defiance, one headline read. Hoover was furious, but he never stopped feeding the cycle. He understood the paradox. To catch a criminal, the Bureau needed people to look at him, but the more they looked, the more they humanized him. Fear turned to fascination, fascination to obsession. And soon, the Bureau wasn't just hunting fugitives. It was competing with them for fame. Somewhere between morality and marketing, a new archetype was born, the American outlaw of the modern age. He wasn't hiding in the wilderness anymore. He was walking among us, well-dressed, clever, smiling for cameras he couldn't escape. The list became Hoover's stage, but it also became America's therapy session. Each face on the poster represented a collective anxiety. The 1950s were haunted by the shadow of war and the spectre of nuclear fear. The most wanted list gave that fear a human shape. Catching a fugitive was proof that chaos could still be contained, that evil could still be found, and more importantly, photographed. It also redefined the FBI's identity. Before the list, the Bureau was a quiet agency of accountants and lawyers. After the list, it was a brand. Wanted by the FBI became a phrase recognized worldwide, a seal of notoriety, as famous as the Coca-Cola logo. And that notoriety was addictive. Politicians referenced the list to show moral toughness. Movie studios borrowed its imagery for crime thrillers. The public started using the phrase "most wanted" as slang for anyone too rebellious to fit neatly into society's script. But the game was changing fast. As the decade rolled into the early 60s, a different breed of fugitive was emerging. They weren't just robbing banks or skipping bail. They were challenging the very definition of law. Ideology was replacing greed as the motive, and Hoover's neat morality play was starting to unravel. The Bureau could handle robbers. It didn't know how to handle revolutionaries. Still, in those early years, the romance of the chase held America captive. The most wanted list was modern folklore, told in mugshots instead of myths. People believed in it the way ancient cultures believed in monsters. Each fugitive was a story that made the rest of the country feel righteous by comparison. The Bureau, for all its manipulation, had tapped into something primal. The need to believe in heroes and villains, even when both lived in the same house. The irony was that, as much as Hoover claimed to despise fame, he had created the perfect stage for it. Every new fugitive was a casting call, every capture a finale. He was the director, the editor, the narrator. America watched, and for a while, everyone believed that was enough to keep the darkness in check. But the next decade would prove that darkness doesn't vanish under scrutiny. It multiplies. The 1960s would introduce a new kind of criminal, not the outlaw who robbed banks, but the one who robbed peace of mind: bombers, spies, revolutionaries. The most wanted list would become less about crime and more about ideology, a barometer for national panic. Still, back in the 1950s, that future was unimaginable. For now, America slept easy, dreaming of neat endings and perfect justice. The posters hung in every post office, every courthouse, every diner. Faces stared back, frozen in black and white, while a nation stared forward, certain that catching these men would somehow keep the world safe. And in the echo of those wanted posters, the first myth of modern justice was born: that exposure is the same thing as truth. By the dawn of the 1960s, the story had changed. The smiling criminals of the post-war era, slick bank robbers, smooth con men, headline-friendly crooks, were fading. America was no longer looking for charming outlaws. It was looking for enemies. The Cold War had melted into everything: art, science, suburbia, and law enforcement. J. Edgar Hoover saw the shift coming and adjusted the script. The most wanted list stopped being a gallery of thieves and became a catalogue of threat. The language hardened. Phrases like armed and extremely dangerous were replaced by subversive tendencies and possible communist connections. The new villains weren't swaggering hold-up men. They were intellectuals, activists, spies. And the Bureau's list became the bulletin board for America's paranoia. Take Ruth Eiserman Scheer, who would later become the first woman on the list. She wasn't a killer or a traitor. She was part of a kidnapping that fascinated the country because it blurred morality. A woman criminal was news. She symbolized the shifting gender lines of a decade in rebellion. Her eventual capture became less about her crime and more about restoring the illusion of control. Or Richard Lawrence Marquette, whose brutal crimes shook the Bureau into realizing that evil wasn't always glamorous. His photograph, dead eyes, unshaven face, stood in contrast to the charming rogues of the 1950s. America's villains had grown darker, more primal. The FBI's posters began using color photos, not for clarity, but for shock value. It was no longer theater. It was a mirror, and the reflection was ugly. Hoover, aging but still omnipotent, understood the new world demanded new symbols. He doubled down on the idea that visibility equals control. Every television broadcast that showed a fugitive's face was another affirmation that the Bureau still ruled the narrative. But the culture was slipping out of his grasp. The youth movement, civil rights protests, the rise of dissent, all of it rewrote what criminal looked like. To many Americans, the man on the most wanted poster no longer looked like a monster. He looked like a martyr. The Bureau's target list began to include activists from groups it deemed radical. Members of the Black Liberation Army, the Weather Underground, the Symbionese Liberation Army. These weren't robbers in getaway cars. They were political statements in motion. The FBI chased them with the same ferocity it once reserved for gangsters. The narrative blurred. Was the Bureau protecting peace or policing thought? Media coverage shifted again. For the first time, journalists began questioning the institution itself. The most wanted list, once sacred, was now a public relations weapon, and everyone knew it. Civil rights leaders accused Hoover of using it to demonize movements rather than enforce laws. College students wore shirts printed with FBI's Next Most Wanted. Pop culture was no longer echoing the Bureau's message. It was mocking it. Still, the manhunts were spectacular. The chase for Angela Davis, for instance, became international theatre. Davis, a scholar and activist, was accused of aiding an attempted courtroom escape that ended in bloodshed. When her name hit the most wanted list in 1970, it made history. Posters of her face, afro-haloed in shadow, were everywhere. But the image had power beyond Hoover's control. To millions, it wasn't a warning. It was inspiration. Her eventual arrest and acquittal turned the Bureau's publicity machine inside out. The most wanted list had made her famous and untouchable. For Hoover, it was a nightmare dressed as success. The Bureau could still capture people, but it was losing its monopoly on meaning. The list had become a battlefield of interpretation. Every face meant something different depending on who looked. To the state, they were threats. To the streets, they were proof that rebellion was real. Technology kept evolving, and so did the tactics. The Bureau began experimenting with early data systems, using punch card databases to track patterns. Every new fugitive meant new code, new cross-referencing, new bureaucracy. The chase was becoming impersonal, statistics replacing hunches, printouts replacing instinct. Agents who'd once followed footprints in the dirt now followed numbers. The age of the mythic G-Man was ending. But the most wanted list endured, because it had become more than a tool. It was a ritual. Every update reassured the public that someone was still keeping watch, even as faith in authority eroded everywhere else. The posters hung beside anti-war flyers. The two ideologies stared at each other across bulletin boards in small-town post offices, a quiet argument between law and liberty. By the time Hoover died in 1972, the most wanted list had survived him. It had outlived its architect, evolving the way all myths do, absorbing criticism, transforming, refusing extinction. The Bureau that followed tried to modernize, to soften the edges of Hoover's empire, but the ghost of his vision remained. The list was too famous, too woven into America's nervous system to disappear. When the Watergate era exposed corruption at the highest levels, the FBI's credibility wavered. Yet the most wanted posters still carried weight. They were simple, tangible, unambiguous in a time when nothing else felt certain. People could look at those faces and believe that evil was still a matter of arrest warrants and mugshots, not policy or politics. The irony was that the Bureau's most enduring creation, the list, no longer needed the Bureau at all. It had become part of culture's DNA, a permanent feedback loop between fear and fascination. By naming evil, the FBI had taught America to crave it. Every generation since would inherit that hunger, the need to see faces behind the word danger, the comfort of thinking that if the villains were printed on posters, the rest of us must still be safe. The 1960s ended not with closure but with noise, riots, protests, the fall of Hoover's carefully curated myth. But the list survived because it didn't depend on peace. It thrived on anxiety. And America, even in its moments of greatest triumph, never stopped being anxious. That was Hoover's unspoken genius. The most wanted list wasn't designed to end crime. It was designed to keep the story going. Before there were printed lists, before the Bureau even had a public face, there were headlines that made criminals into legends. The Great Depression had stripped America bare. Banks collapsed, jobs vanished, and hope became a luxury. Outlaws filled the vacuum. To a country suffocating under debt, the men who robbed the very institutions that had ruined them became folk heroes. They didn't just steal money, they stole revenge. And it was from this chaos that the FBI's myth of moral authority was born. In 1933, when the Bureau was still awkwardly named the Division of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover was just beginning to realize how useful fear could be. Law enforcement was fragmented, underfunded, and local sheriffs were no match for gangsters armed with Tommy guns and fast cars. The newspapers loved these criminals, John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson, and wrote about them like movie stars. Hoover, seeing himself on the losing end of that narrative, decided that if he couldn't outgun them, he would outstory them. And so began the public relations war that would define American justice for a century. The press had crowned Dillinger the Robin Hood of the Midwest, but Hoover made sure to rewrite the legend. He ordered agents to issue detailed accounts of every pursuit, every gunfight, every triumph. The Bureau's first national manhunt was as much about rebranding as it was about law enforcement. Public enemy number one, Hoover declared, a phrase that sounded biblical, absolute. Dillinger's face was suddenly everywhere, newspapers, newsreels, even postcards. He was America's favorite villain and Hoover's favorite prop. Dillinger's story was cinematic perfection. He escaped from jail using a fake wooden gun, humiliated police across multiple states, and turned every capture into an escape scene worthy of Hollywood. Crowds lined streets where he was rumored to appear, hoping to catch a glimpse of the outlaw who made fools of the powerful. Every act of rebellion fed the press. Every photograph of his smirk undermined authority. The Bureau looked clumsy, provincial, even comic, until July 22, 1934, outside the Biograph Theatre in Chicago. That night, as Dillinger walked out of the cinema with two women, agents opened fire. The headline screamed, "Dillinger dead," and Hoover's legend was born alongside the corpse. America's first great manhunt had ended in a blood-stained sidewalk. The Bureau was reborn, not as an office of investigators, but as the nation's avenger. The formula was addictive. The public didn't just want justice, they wanted spectacle. Within months, the Bureau turned its sights on another fugitive, George Babyface Nelson, a sociopath with a cherubic grin and a love for chaos. Nelson's spree was pure nihilism, robberies, murders, shootouts that left civilians dead. To Hoover, he was the perfect villain, photogenic and unredeemable. The Bureau hunted him with theatrical precision, feeding updates to newspapers as though narrating a serialized drama. Nelson's final stand came in November 1934. Cornered near Barrington, Illinois, he exchanged fire with agents in a violent, almost operatic gunfight. Both he and two agents were killed. The Bureau published photos of his bullet-riddled Ford as proof of victory. It was gruesome, but effective. The message was clear. The law could now kill its myths. Then came Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, whose legend was perhaps the most complicated. In Oklahoma, where poverty had hit hardest, Floyd was considered a hero, a farmer's son who robbed banks and burned mortgage papers, freeing families from debt. The Bureau painted him differently, a cold-blooded murderer. Hoover personally ordered a relentless campaign to erase Floyd's Robin Hood image, calling him a killer in cheap perfume. When agents gunned him down in a cornfield in 1934, witnesses said he raised his hands to surrender. The official version said otherwise. Truth mattered less than narrative. The FBI was writing its origin story in blood and ink. These men, mythologized by both sides of the press, forced the Bureau to evolve. Hoover began standardizing the look and tone of wanted posters. No glamour, no personality, just the stark confrontation of a face and a list of crimes. Every photo was carefully chosen to dehumanize. Gone were the smirks and stylish suits. In their place, mugshots lit like mugshots, all shadow and guilt. But the public couldn't let go of the romance. Newspapers printed composite stories that blurred fact and fantasy, painting the 1930s as a war between the system and the free spirit. Dillinger and Nelson might have been criminals, but they were human, visible, alive. The Bureau, in contrast, was faceless, efficient but mechanical. Hoover understood this and turned it into advantage. He crafted the FBI's image as that of disciplined soldiers in a moral crusade, the exact opposite of the chaotic outlaws they hunted. When World War II began, that contrast became invaluable. The Bureau leveraged its reputation as the slayer of gangsters to sell itself as the guardian of democracy. The gangster age faded, but the myth endured. The 1940s brought spies, saboteurs, and traitors, new villains for a new era, but their roots lay in Dillinger's ghost. Every new fugitive was a descendant of that first perfect outlaw. The Depression-era manhunts taught Hoover everything he needed to know about narrative control. Keep the story simple, keep the villain visible, and make sure every victory feels personal. It was that formula he'd revive in 1950 when he created the 10 Most Wanted list. What had begun as chaos was now science. The outlaw was still the face of fear, but now the Bureau owned the mirror. In hindsight, those early years were the FBI's creation myth, a time when it discovered that control of the story was control of reality. The Bureau's war against Dillinger, Nelson, and Floyd wasn't just law enforcement, it was nation-building. It gave Americans something to root for, something to believe in, a clear line between good and evil, no matter how blurry it really was. The irony, of course, is that Hoover's Bureau and the criminals it hunted were two sides of the same coin, both obsessed with power, both driven by ego, both masters of publicity. Each made the other immortal. And even now, decades later, the echoes of that rivalry still shape how the world thinks about justice. Every wanted poster, every breaking news alert, every televised manhunt is a descendant of that summer night in Chicago when gunfire outside a movie theater turned myth into institution. That was the night America learned to love its villains and to trust its hunters even more. By the end of the 1930s, the gangster era was dying, but its ghost refused to rest. The country had traded its speakeasies and machine guns for ration cards and factories, yet the craving for spectacle hadn't faded, it had only evolved. Hoover's Bureau had emerged from the chaos, polished and triumphant, its suits pressed, its agents photographed like Hollywood stars. What began as a scrappy division of investigators had become America's most powerful myth-making machine, and it was about to find new villains to fill the void left by Dillinger's corpse. The gangster had served his purpose. He was rebellion made flesh, but he'd also given Hoover a blueprint, how to turn fear into fascination. When World War II erupted, that same formula was redeployed for a new kind of story. The public enemy became the enemy agent. The Bureau's propaganda shifted tone but not rhythm. Posters once filled with rugged bank robbers now displayed silhouettes of foreign spies and saboteurs. Hoover called them the invisible assassins, and the public, still addicted to the moral clarity of the Dillinger days, swallowed the new narrative whole. The Bureau's hunts moved from dusty Midwestern highways to shadowy networks of espionage. Men like Duquesne, the South African-born spy who ran a Nazi espionage ring on US soil, became the new villains. The Duquesne spy ring was broken in 1941, the largest espionage case in American history at the time. Hoover made sure the story broke across every front page. His agents didn't just catch spies, they saved the Republic. And in that story, the FBI became untouchable. But behind the polished photos and the newsreels, something else was happening. The Bureau was learning how to manipulate perception with frightening precision. Hoover realized that fear wasn't just a weapon against criminals, it was a currency. Each poster, each radio announcement, each most wanted-style bulletin was a transaction, public trust in exchange for a constant reminder of danger. The people wanted to believe the Bureau was protecting them, so the Bureau made sure danger never disappeared completely. The gangsters had taught Hoover how to build legends. The Cold War would teach him how to sustain them indefinitely. As the nation's enemies went from bootleggers to communists, the Bureau's tone shifted again. Public enemy number one became national security threat. The words changed, but the psychology didn't. America had learned to love a good chase, and the Bureau kept the chase alive. In those post-war years, Hoover perfected the myth of the all-seeing eye. FBI posters were everywhere. Train stations, bus depots, post offices, schools. Faces stared out from behind glass cases, paper sentinels guarding the borders of peace. People trusted those faces more than they trusted politicians. The Bureau had become a brand of safety, its logo as recognizable as the American flag. The most wanted list wasn't yet official, but its essence already existed, a curated collection of nightmares, refreshed whenever the story demanded new villains. The rise of Hollywood only magnified the effect. Films like G-Men, 1935, and You Can't Get Away with It, turned Bureau agents into cinematic heroes, disciplined, emotionless, incorruptible. Hoover personally approved the scripts, insisting that every movie depict agents as moral paragons. It was soft power disguised as entertainment. The same audiences who'd once idolized gangsters now idolized the men who hunted them. The moral pendulum had swung, but the addiction remained the same. When television arrived, the formula adapted seamlessly. Hoover's Bureau had become a visual institution. The director's face itself, rigid, immovable, framed by dark suits and darker eyes, was a brand. Newsreels treated him like royalty. No one elected Hoover, yet few officials in Washington wielded as much authority. The public had made a silent trade. Truth for reassurance, privacy for protection. The Bureau promised safety, and in return, America let it define what safe meant. Yet beneath the veneer of order, paranoia was brewing. The McCarthy era saw Hoover's tactics weaponized beyond even his intentions. The Red Scare turned the country's fear of crime into fear of thought. Lists multiplied, not just most wanted but suspected subversives, un-American activities, potential threats. The logic of the Dillinger chase had metastasized into ideology. Hoover no longer needed gunfights to prove control. He had dossiers, files, whispers. The line between criminal and dissenter blurred, and the Bureau stood proudly at the center of it. Still, the public loved the illusion. Every captured spy, every thwarted plot reaffirmed the same story. The good guys were still winning. The Bureau fed the press just enough detail to keep the suspense alive. They never saw the missteps, the dead leads, the innocent lives crushed in the machinery of suspicion. What mattered wasn't accuracy, it was rhythm. The chase could never end, because ending it would mean losing relevance. By the time the official 10 Most Wanted list debuted in 1950, The Bureau's methods were already decades refined. Hoover's empire of perception was complete. The posters were clean, consistent, surgical in their simplicity. The mugshots were no longer just warnings, they were icons, the visual descendants of Dillinger's grin and Nelson's death glare. The Bureau had turned crime into a consumable narrative, and America couldn't stop watching. The irony was perfect. The same public that once idolized criminals now idolized the institution that hunted them. Hoover's dream of moral clarity had triumphed, but only because he'd learned to package fear as faith. And yet deep down, he must have known the victory was fragile. Every empire built on myth eventually meets reality. The Bureau's control depended on the illusion that its list of enemies was complete, its power unchallenged. But history has no patience for neat endings. The gangster age had taught the FBI how to tell its story. The Cold War would test whether the country still believed it. The last gangsters were gone, buried in shallow graves or frozen in black and white photos. But their ghosts lingered, whispering through the machinery of propaganda they had accidentally inspired. They had shown America that crime, in the right hands, could be theater. Hoover took that truth and industrialized it. The FBI didn't just chase criminals, it curated them. And from those curated faces, the most wanted list would soon be born, an inheritance of violence, fame, and storytelling printed on government letterhead. Hoover had turned the chaos of the Depression into a machine of control. The public called it justice. The Bureau called it progress. But deep down, both knew it was something else entirely: entertainment, the kind that never ends. By the early 1970s, Hoover's empire stood at its zenith and on the brink of implosion. The Bureau that had once paraded its triumphs on post office walls and silver screens was now haunted by the same paranoia it had spent decades manufacturing. The most wanted list still hung across America, each face a reminder of danger, but something in the national mood had shifted. Fear had lost its innocence. The villains weren't strangers anymore. They were neighbors, students, politicians, even presidents. Hoover, now a relic in his own marble fortress, refused to adapt. To him, the Bureau's sacred duty was to preserve the American way, though what that meant was defined entirely by his own prejudices. His files bulged with secrets, dossiers on civil rights leaders, senators, celebrities, anyone who dared to question his authority. He had wiretaps in hotel rooms, microphones in offices, spies in protest movements. His reach was limitless, his justification always the same: protection of the nation. But by then, even his allies were beginning to whisper that the Guardian had become the threat. The most wanted list reflected this tension. Once the proud banner of American justice, it had turned into a mirror showing the Bureau's own anxieties. Fugitives like Leonard Peltier, a member of the American Indian movement, symbolized not just criminal pursuit, but cultural conflict. His case blurred the line between law and politics, rebellion and revenge. Activists called him a political prisoner. The Bureau called him a murderer. Each poster was a statement, not of law enforcement, but of ideology. Then came Patricia Hearst, granddaughter of the newspaper tycoon, kidnapped and then radicalized by the Symbionese Liberation Army. Her face, too, landed on the most wanted list. It was Hoover's perfect tragedy. A rich girl turned outlaw, a symbol of how disorder could infect even the purest bloodlines. When she was captured, the story was too strange to simplify. America no longer knew who the villains were. Behind the scenes, the Bureau's own scandals began leaking into daylight. The Vietnam War had turned public trust into ash, and investigative journalists were hungry for truth. In 1971, a group calling themselves the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. What they found, and mailed to newspapers, shattered the Bureau's immaculate image. COINTELPRO, the FBI's secret domestic surveillance program, was exposed in full. Files revealed years of illegal spying, blackmail, psychological warfare against political figures, and manipulation of the press. The most wanted list, it turned out, had been just the surface of a much larger machinery of control. The same institution that claimed to defend democracy had been undermining it from within. The revelation hit like an earthquake. For the first time, the Bureau's image, carefully curated through decades of propaganda, cracked under scrutiny. Newspapers no longer treated Hoover like a saint. They treated him like a monarch whose crown had rotted. Congressional hearings followed. The same headlines that once glorified FBI captures now demanded answers about its crimes. Hoover died in 1972, his body found in his home surrounded by trophies and unopened reports. His death ended an era, but not the shadow he cast. The Bureau he left behind was both revered and reviled, a myth too valuable to kill and too corrupted to trust. His most wanted list, however, endured. It had outlived its creator because it was bigger than him now. It was part of America's nervous system, pulsing with the same rhythm of suspicion and spectacle that had birthed it. As Watergate unfolded and the president himself became the nation's most wanted liar, irony hung heavy. The most wanted list had been designed to reassure Americans that their government was moral, that justice was consistent. Now it stood as a symbol of contradiction, a bureaucracy chasing fugitives while the powerful committed crimes in plain sight. The posters kept coming, the headlines kept spinning, but the innocence of the chase was gone. Yet even in disgrace, the FBI adapted. New leadership promised reform, transparency, restraint. The most wanted list was cleaned up. No more political targets, no more ideological crusades. It returned, at least on paper, to its original purpose, capturing the dangerous and the violent. But the damage was permanent. The public had seen behind the curtain. The magic trick would never work quite the same again. Still, the list remained a staple of American identity. It wasn't about trust anymore, it was about continuity. Every face added to it reminded the country that danger never sleeps, that safety always demands vigilance. And perhaps that was the Bureau's greatest survival mechanism. It had turned fear into ritual. The posters were no longer promises, they were prayers. The irony was poetic. Hoover had built the Bureau to be eternal, and in a way, he succeeded. The faces on the most wanted list changed. The crimes evolved, the technology advanced, but the purpose stayed the same. It wasn't about who was wanted, it was about reminding everyone else that they weren't. By the mid-1970s, America's golden age of certainty was over. The villains of the Depression had become legends, the radicals of the 60s had become politicians, and the FBI had become an institution haunted by its own legend. The most wanted list endured because the country needed it to. In a world where morality had become negotiable, it offered something simple, a wall of faces labeled evil. And simplicity, no matter how artificial, was comforting. As Hoover's shadow faded, new generations of agents would inherit his creation without fully understanding the machinery beneath it. They'd keep printing posters, updating databases, and telling the same story, one villain at a time. And the public, still addicted to fear, would keep watching. Because in America, the most wanted list was never just about crime. It was about faith. The belief that if the government could catch its monsters, maybe the rest of us could sleep through the night. The post-Hoover FBI emerged blinking into the sunlight of the late 1970s, awkward and uncertain. For the first time in its history, the Bureau had to answer questions instead of asking them. The myth of perfection was gone, replaced by congressional hearings, leaked files, and a public no longer willing to believe in heroes without proof. Yet the most wanted list remained. A stubborn relic, steady and iconic, still pinned to walls in post offices across the nation like a national totem. It was the Bureau's simplest form of truth. Faces, names, crimes. Everything else, politics, morality, corruption, could stay hidden. The world, however, was changing faster than the Bureau could print posters. America was no longer haunted by outlaws or spies. It was entering the age of the global fugitive. Air travel, new technologies, and international networks made escape an art form. Criminals no longer needed hideouts, they needed passports. Terrorists, drug lords, and mercenaries began moving through borders as easily as headlines. The Bureau, long obsessed with order, suddenly found itself chasing chaos that didn't play by national rules. To survive, the FBI had to evolve, or at least pretend to. The new faces on the most wanted list were symptoms of a larger disease, globalization without conscience. There was Victor Garina, a mild-mannered armored truck guard who vanished with $7 million in Connecticut's largest heist, leaving behind a trail of Marxist pamphlets and rumors of Cuban connections. For decades, his name lingered on the list like a ghost, outlasting presidents and wars. Then came Donald Eugene Webb, accused of killing a police chief in Massachusetts and disappearing so completely he became a legend in law enforcement folklore. He stayed on the list for 37 years, longer than any fugitive in FBI history, until his remains were finally discovered beneath his ex-wife's backyard shed. Each new fugitive had a different story, but together they marked the Bureau's slow drift from crime to complexity. Gone were the days of clean narratives and righteous gunfights. The Bureau now dealt in ambiguity, terror plots with uncertain origins, financial crimes that crossed oceans, ideological violence that defied nationality. The most wanted list, once a stage for outlaws, had become a barometer for the world's anxieties. The 1980s brought a different kind of criminal, glamorous, global, and horrifyingly efficient. Ramon Boza, drug trafficker and enforcer, reflected the rise of cartels that turned cocaine into an empire. The Bureau's war on drugs blurred into an endless pursuit that stretched from Miami to Medellin. When Pablo Escobar's associates made headlines, Hoover's heirs saw opportunity, new villains, new funding, new purpose. The FBI leaned into the narrative, promoting the most wanted list as a global justice initiative. The posters changed languages, the photos turned digital, and America's war against chaos became international. Then came Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, an anomaly that brought the Bureau face to face with its own reflection. A man who despised modernity, who lived in a cabin without electricity, and who targeted the very systems that made the FBI powerful. His crimes were surgical, his manifesto philosophical. For years, he taunted the Bureau, mailing bombs and letters that dissected the psychology of control. When the FBI finally caught him in 1996, it wasn't through surveillance or intelligence, it was through language. His brother recognized his writing in a published excerpt and turned him in. The irony was poetic. The Bureau that had built its empire on observation was undone and redeemed by human instinct. As technology advanced, so did the chase. By the 1990s, the most wanted list had gone digital. Faces once confined to post offices now lived on computer screens and eventually the internet. The first online fugitive profile belonged to Leslie Rogge, a clever bank robber who used technology to stay invisible. His capture, triggered when someone recognized him from an online wanted poster, marked a new age. The FBI no longer needed citizens to visit post offices, it brought the posters to them. The shift wasn't just logistical, it was philosophical. The most wanted list had always been about power, but now that power was networked. Every click, every shared photo, every viral tip was proof that fear had become interactive. The Bureau didn't need to preach vigilance anymore, it crowdsourced it. Yet, with every innovation came new ghosts. Osama bin Laden, the face that defined a generation of fear, turned the most wanted list into global theatre. His addition in 1999 marked the Bureau's complete transformation from a domestic agency into a symbolic army in an invisible war. The list, once about fugitives with names and crimes, now carried ideology itself. Bin Laden wasn't just wanted, he was hated, hunted, mythologized. His death in 2011 didn't end the story, it only reinforced it. The most wanted list had transcended law enforcement. It had become America's moral scoreboard, a digital pantheon of enemies, both real and imagined. The posters no longer just warned, they performed. They told the public, here is evil, and we are its opposite. It didn't matter that many fugitives were never caught, or that others quietly surrendered years later. The performance was what mattered. The illusion of vigilance had become the nation's favorite comfort. But under the surface, the Bureau was still haunted by its founder's ghost. Hoover's methods, control through visibility, order through fear, remained embedded in the culture. The tools had changed, but the story hadn't. The FBI still needed villains to stay relevant, and the most wanted list still provided them. The 2000s blurred everything further. Cybercrime exploded, terrorism redefined borders, and the internet turned fugitives into memes. But through it all, the list endured. It didn't just survive the digital age, it adapted to it. Every new platform became another poster wall, every scroll another reminder. And so, just as it had during Hoover's reign, the most wanted list continued to tell America the story it wanted most, that evil was external, identifiable and containable. The names changed, the methods evolved, but the myth remained. The Bureau didn't need to catch every fugitive, it just needed to keep the audience watching. Because in a world drowning in uncertainty, the familiar face of a wanted poster was still the most reassuring fiction of all. The 21st century began not with a whisper, but with smoke and sirens. 9/11 shattered whatever illusions of safety America still clung to, and the FBI, shaken but opportunistic, seized the chaos to redefine itself once again. The most wanted list, once a quiet ritual of justice, was reborn as an international manifesto. The faces changed from fugitives on the run to architects of ideology, shadows hiding in deserts and data streams. Fear was no longer local, it was global, and Hoover's ghost, wherever it lingered, must have smiled. Almost overnight, the list became a political weapon and a moral compass. Its tone hardened, its scope expanded. No longer just America's 10 most wanted, it became a symbol of global authority, broadcast through CNN, the White House, and the early web. Osama bin Laden, at the top of the list, became less a man and more a brand, a single image that condensed a decade of grief, vengeance, and paranoia. His photograph, bearded, calm, unrepentant, hung like an icon of modern evil. But bin Laden's inclusion did more than galvanize a nation. It revealed how the most wanted list had evolved beyond law enforcement. It was no longer about capture, it was about reassurance. Every time his image appeared, it reminded Americans that their government still had enemies, and therefore still had purpose. The Bureau's role had transcended justice. It was now psychological theater. When bin Laden was finally killed in 2011, the world cheered, but the machinery didn't stop. It couldn't. Fear abhors a vacuum. Within days, new names filled the slots: terrorists, cybercriminals, and foreign operatives. The posters no longer depicted just mugshots, but pixelated composites, artist-generated predictions of faces that might not even exist anymore. The Bureau had entered a new dimension: the algorithmic manhunt. The next generation of fugitives weren't flesh-and-blood bank robbers hiding in basements. They were ghosts in fiber optics, hackers who stole identities, state-sponsored spies who corrupted code, masterminds who never left their keyboards. The Bureau's digital reach extended across oceans, and the most wanted list followed suit, hosted on government servers, mirrored across 1,000 websites. The once iconic paper poster had become data, tracked, cached, copied, immortal. And yet something fundamental had been lost. The most wanted list had always thrived on personality: the outlaw's grin, the killer's eyes, the sense that evil had a face. But algorithms don't have expressions. Digital fugitives lacked the mythic aura of Dillinger or Bundy. They weren't cinematic. They were statistical. So the Bureau adapted again, infusing its new narratives with modern myth-making. Cybercriminals became digital predators. Hackers became cyber-terrorists. The list's language evolved to fit the screen, briefer, sharper, designed to scroll. It worked. Each new edition was a media event, complete with press conferences and FBI-branded social media posts. The Bureau had learned the rules of virality. Fear, it turned out, worked perfectly in an algorithmic world. People shared top 10 most wanted posts, like gossip, each share another digital prayer for order. The Bureau had once nailed posters to walls. Now it pinned them to timelines. But as the line between surveillance and protection blurred, so did the moral clarity of the chase. The digital age turned everyone into both observer and observed. Your phone's camera, your browser's cookies, your social media habits. Each a silent informant feeding a system that no longer needed humans to watch. Hoover's dream of total visibility had been realized, not through paranoia, but through convenience. We had volunteered for the cage. The Bureau, too, became more automated. Facial recognition replaced eyewitnesses. Predictive analytics suggested suspects before crimes even occurred. The most wanted list itself became a data-driven artifact curated by software that analyzed global threats and prioritized based on probability. The romanticism of the fugitive, once an outlaw darting across highways, was replaced by the cold efficiency of metadata. Evil, once personal, had become programmable. Still, the old myth persisted because humans crave narrative. The Bureau continued to give them one. Faces like Ayman al-Zawahiri, Semyon Mogilevich, and Rafael Caro Quintero populated the digital wall of shame, names that blended old-world crime with new-world reach. Drug lords and cyber mercenaries shared the same screen, proof that the most wanted list was now less a hierarchy of danger and more an anthology of fear. But here's the irony. The longer the list survived, the more it exposed the futility of its promise. Many of its entries died years before they were officially removed. Others were captured quietly, off-camera, without the theatricality that once defined the Bureau's glory days. The list had become self-sustaining, an organism that didn't need resolution to function. It didn't matter whether the fugitives were caught. What mattered was that they remained wanted. Meanwhile, technology had democratized the game. Online sleuths, conspiracy theorists, and armchair detectives joined the chase. Entire Reddit threads emerged dissecting clues, faces, and patterns. The same internet that had once empowered the FBI now competed with it. The Bureau no longer owned the narrative. It had to share it with the crowd. And the crowd didn't play by the same rules. By the 2020s, the Most Wanted list had become an archive of contradictions. It was both historical record and live feed, a reminder of how America defines evil depending on the decade. The villains of today weren't robbers or spies. They were hackers, human traffickers, war criminals hiding behind digital walls. The Bureau's posters, once black and white symbols of authority, now lived as pixels, scrollable, shareable, algorithmically ranked. And maybe that was the most haunting transformation of all. The Most Wanted list had started as a tool to make the invisible visible. Now it existed in a world where visibility itself was the crime. Everyone was watched, everyone was traceable, and privacy, once a citizen's right, had become the fugitive. Somewhere in the archives of Quantico, the original Most Wanted posters still hang, yellowed, creased, their typewritten letters fading. Dillinger's grin, Bundy's dead eyes, Sutton's smirk, all relics of an era when evil looked like a person. Today, evil looks like an IP address. And yet, the ritual continues. 10 names, 10 faces, 10 ghosts for a restless nation. Because no matter how the world evolves, America still needs to believe it can point to a face, on paper or on a screen, and say, that's the bad guy. It's simpler that way. 75 years. That's how long the FBI's Most Wanted list has been staring back at America, like a mirror it can't quite look away from. What started as 10 names on a sheet of paper tacked to a post office wall has survived wars, scandals, and the collapse of nearly every institution that once defined trust. Presidents have fallen, ideologies have burned out, technology has rewritten the world. But the list, that unblinking ritual of suspicion, endures. It's easy to call it a success story. Over 500 fugitives captured, countless crimes solved, generations taught to stay vigilant. But beneath the statistics lies something deeper and darker. The realization that the Most Wanted list didn't just hunt criminals, it shaped how America thinks about crime itself. J. Edgar Hoover's ghost still lingers in every design decision, every press release, every update to that ever-changing digital wall of fear. The list was never just about justice. It was about psychology. It trained people to equate visibility with guilt, to believe that danger has a face and safety has a logo. And in that belief, the Bureau didn't just protect the nation, it programmed it. Think about it. Every decade the list evolved, but its structure never changed. 10 faces, 10 stories, 10 warnings. It's an elegant illusion. It tells us that evil is finite, that it can be counted and categorized. It gives chaos a border, a name, a mugshot. And in a country built on anxiety, economic, political, existential, that illusion is priceless. Fear needs organization. The Bureau gave it one. But the list also became something Hoover never intended: entertainment. By the 1980s, television crime shows used its format like gospel. America's Most Wanted, hosted by John Walsh, turned the Bureau's grim bulletin into a Saturday night ritual. Viewers gathered around their screens to help catch killers, rapists, and thieves, heroes of justice fighting through commercial breaks. Ratings were massive. People didn't just want to know about evil. They wanted to participate in defeating it. The show blurred the line between news and narrative, between vigilance and voyeurism. The same impulse that made Depression-era crowds cheer for Dillinger now made them cheer for his downfall. America had perfected its favorite moral paradox, fear as entertainment. The Bureau was happy to cooperate. Every televised arrest was free publicity, every successful tip a testament to the system's righteousness. But as decades rolled on, the message became confused. People started seeing the most wanted list, not as a reflection of real danger, but as a running series. This week's villains, next season's fugitives. Evil had become episodic. That shift revealed something telling about American psychology. The most wanted list had trained a nation to measure justice emotionally, not rationally. It wasn't about who deserved to be there. It was about who made us feel safest when they were caught. The Bureau knew this instinctively. Fear sells, resolution sells better. And so each new face wasn't just a fugitive. It was a performance of moral renewal. Still, the question lingers. What did the list actually accomplish beyond its numbers? Did it deter crime? Not really. Did it make the public safer? Occasionally. What it truly did, what it still does, is provide meaning. It turns chaos into narrative. Every time the Bureau updates the list, it's writing a new chapter in America's ongoing story of anxiety and redemption. The villains may change, but the message remains. The world is dangerous, but someone is watching over you. It's the oldest story in civilization. Fear of the dark soothed by the promise of the watchman. The most wanted list just digitized it. But as the digital age matures, that story feels less certain. The internet democratized exposure. The Bureau is no longer the sole storyteller. Every citizen is now both observer and broadcaster. Viral videos, leaked documents, open source investigations, people create their own lists every day. Some are righteous, others reckless. And in that noise, the authority of the FBI's poster has begun to fade. A government list once carried divine weight. Now it competes with hashtags. Even so, the image persists, those 10 faces, that seal, that subtle suggestion that justice is still organized, still capable, still winning. Because in a world drowning in ambiguity, symbols matter more than truth. Yet the irony is inescapable. The most wanted list's greatest legacy might not be the criminals it caught, but the mirror it held up to the country that created it. It showed how easily righteousness can become ritual, how quickly justice becomes performance. It taught America that fear can be managed, marketed, even monetized. And in doing so, it made the Bureau's myth eternal. Hoover wanted the list to make the FBI immortal. He got his wish, but at a cost. The Bureau became the storyteller of America's nightmares, and the public, addicted to those stories, stopped questioning who was writing them. The truth is, the most wanted list isn't about fugitives. It's about faith. Faith that the system still works. Faith that evil still looks like a mugshot, not a suit or a corporation or a keyboard. Faith that justice is still a story with an ending. But faith is fragile. And when the story ends, when the screen fades, when the poster peels off the wall, what's left behind isn't comfort. It's the silence of a world that realizes evil doesn't need a face to exist. Still, every few months, the Bureau quietly updates its digital list. 10 new names, 10 new photographs, the same caption beneath each one, wanted by the FBI. The words don't change because they don't have to. The message is timeless. It's Hoover's last sermon, echoing through decades of data and doubt. We are watching. And maybe that's why the list still works. Not because it catches the guilty, but because it keeps the rest of us looking over our shoulders, grateful for the illusion that someone, somewhere, is still in charge. By the time the 2020s rolled around, the Most Wanted list had transcended its origins completely. It was no longer just a government document. It was an archetype, a shape burned into the American subconscious. The Bureau still updated it, of course, with new faces, new crimes, new digital fingerprints. But the world had caught up. Now everyone, from social media mobs to investigative YouTubers, had their own version of a Most Wanted list. The FBI had invented the format. The internet had perfected it. In a way, it was poetic. J. Edgar Hoover had once dreamed of a society that policed itself, a world where citizens watched each other so faithfully that crime became impossible. He just didn't imagine it would look like this. Millions of people online dissecting faces, speculating about guilt, building narratives faster than the Bureau could verify facts. Justice had become viral content, and fear had become entertainment again. The modern Most Wanted list reflects that transformation. It still sits on the FBI's website, sleek and sterile, filled with names of cyber criminals, hackers, human traffickers, and fugitives who use encryption instead of guns. Their crimes are technical, their faces emotionless, their motives abstract. No bank robberies, no dramatic getaways, just stolen data, crashed servers, and faceless victims scattered across continents. Evil has gone paperless. But while the crimes have changed, the psychology hasn't. We still crave faces. We need something human to aim our anxiety at. The Bureau understands this instinct perfectly. It releases glossy, high-resolution images, composite sketches generated by AI, even interactive timelines that let you follow a fugitive's last known movements. Each case is presented like a documentary trailer. Mysterious music, flashing text, the familiar phrase, considered armed and extremely dangerous. The aesthetic hasn't changed. It's just been optimized for engagement. And engagement is the point. The FBI's digital presence now operates like a brand, complete with hashtags, share buttons, and click metrics. Fear is measurable. Views are trackable. Every time a wanted poster trends, it becomes proof that the Bureau still matters in a world drowning in information. The Most Wanted list is no longer a static warning. It's a marketing campaign that never ends. Pop culture amplifies it endlessly. Streaming platforms pump out true crime documentaries that feel like modern morality plays. YouTubers narrate cold cases in candlelit rooms. Podcasts turn unsolved crimes into serialized sagas with cliffhangers and sponsorships. In this environment, the FBI doesn't have to fight for attention. It's built into the genre. The Most Wanted list has become the spine of a national obsession. Crime as content, fear as identity. But that obsession comes with a price. When everything becomes a story, truth becomes negotiable. Social media rewards outrage, not accuracy. Online sleuths sometimes ruin innocent lives chasing the wrong suspect. Faces are misidentified, motives distorted, reputations destroyed, all in the name of justice that feels participatory. The same crowdsourced vigilance Hoover dreamed of has metastasized into a spectacle without consequence. Everyone is a detective, and no one is accountable. Still, the Bureau plays along. It has learned to speak the language of the modern age, hashtags instead of headlines, updates instead of bulletins. But behind the digital polish, the same paradox remains. The FBI doesn't need the public to solve every crime. It needs the public to stay afraid enough to care. The Most Wanted list doesn't exist to reassure people that justice is done. It exists to remind them that justice is always being pursued, just slightly out of reach. And that's why it works. The list endures because it gives structure to uncertainty. Each new face is a placeholder for whatever the country fears most at that moment: terrorism, technology, corruption, chaos. It's less about who these fugitives are and more about what they represent. When the Bureau uploads a new name, it isn't just updating data, it's updating the nation's mythology. Even Hollywood still follows the pattern. Every spy film, every procedural drama, every Netflix docuseries owes its narrative skeleton to Hoover's original script: order versus anarchy, light versus shadow, 10 faces standing between us and oblivion. We've been rehearsing the same story for 75 years, and we never get tired of it. Because deep down, we need to believe that evil can be contained in a photograph. Yet, the digital era keeps proving otherwise. Today, the world's most dangerous criminals don't leave fingerprints, they leave code. They don't hide in safe houses, they hide in the cloud. The idea of wanted has become abstract. How do you chase someone who doesn't exist physically? How do you define capture in a world where data never dies? The most wanted list, for all its longevity, feels almost nostalgic, like a lighthouse shining into fog that no longer needs light to navigate. But maybe that's the point. Nostalgia is comforting. And the most wanted list has become America's last dependable relic of moral certainty. It doesn't need to evolve to stay relevant. It just needs to exist. As long as there's a list, there's a sense of order. 10 names, 10 sins, 10 promises that evil is still visible, still manageable, still being watched. Somewhere in Quantico, in a climate-controlled archive, the Bureau preserves the original lists, crisp black and white sheets stamped with Hoover's authority. Those faces, once terrifying, now look almost innocent compared to the criminals of today. Their crimes were violent, yes, but simple. You could catch them. You could understand them. Now, danger lives in algorithms and anonymity. The villains don't wear masks anymore. They are the mask. Still, the Bureau persists because it must. The most wanted list has outlived the people who created it, the systems that supported it, even the public that once believed in it unconditionally. It has become a ritual, a chant America repeats to itself whenever the world feels too large to comprehend. These are the bad ones, the Bureau says. Look here, don't look anywhere else. And so we do. We scroll, we click, we watch. Because the most wanted list no longer belongs to the FBI, it belongs to us. It's our reflection, our curated fear, our constant reminder that the line between the hunter and the hunted has never been thinner. In a century where every secret can be hacked and every truth can be edited, the old posters still whisper the same seductive promise they did in 1950. Justice is watching. And maybe that's all America ever wanted, to believe that someone, somewhere, is still keeping score. The most wanted list isn't just history. It's a philosophy, disguised as paperwork. It began as a practical idea: catch criminals faster by showing their faces to the public. But somewhere along the way, it became a national ritual, a meditation on fear and control. For 75 years, it has asked the same quiet question: who deserves to be seen? Every government has its symbols, flags, seals, anthems. But the most wanted list is something else entirely. It's a mirror dressed as a warning. Each name, each photo, each description is more than a record of crime. It's a thesis about morality. When the FBI tells you someone is wanted, it's also telling you something about what the nation fears most in that moment. In the 1950s, it feared outlaws. In the 1960s, it feared ideas. In the 1970s, it feared itself. By the 2000s, it feared everyone. The genius of the list lies in its simplicity. 10 faces, 10 sins, 10 reasons to stay vigilant. That number never changes because it doesn't have to. It's perfect symmetry. Too few, and the threat feels insignificant. Too many, and fear turns to chaos. 10 is order. 10 feels manageable. The Bureau doesn't just track fugitives, it organizes dread. The philosophy behind it is ancient. In medieval times, cities would hang woodcut portraits of exiles and heretics in public squares, branding them as enemies of the crown or church. The most wanted list is that same ritual, updated for democracy. Where kings once declared divine right, the Bureau declares jurisdiction. Where monks once warned of devils, agents warn of armed and dangerous. It's the same old sermon: repent, obey, stay safe. What makes it uniquely American, though, is its optimism. Each poster carries a hidden message: evil can be caught. It's not an unsolvable problem, not an eternal plague. It's a matter of time, effort, and funding. That belief fuels everything from local police budgets to billion-dollar surveillance contracts. The most wanted list reassures us that justice, like a good TV show, always returns next season. But here's the paradox: the list doesn't exist to end crime. It exists to sustain faith in the system that claims to fight it. The moment every fugitive is caught, the myth collapses. The Bureau would lose its reason to speak. The list survives, not in spite of its incompleteness, but because of it. There must always be 10 names. There must always be someone left to chase. That circular logic isn't accidental, it's ideological. The most wanted list is the secular prayer of the surveillance state, an eternal reminder that order is fragile and vigilance is patriotic. You don't question the list, you trust it. You don't ask how names are chosen. You assume righteousness guided the hand. The Bureau, like the priesthoods of old, decides who is pure and who must be seen as impure. And we, the congregation, participate willingly. We repost the photos. We watch the manhunts. We join the search, not because we're coerced, but because it feels good to believe we're on the right side of something. The Bureau doesn't need our obedience, it needs our engagement. Fear is no longer a chain, it's a subscription. There's also something strangely comforting about the idea that evil has a face. In a century overwhelmed by invisible threats, viruses, misinformation, climate collapse, the most wanted list offers a visual focus. A name, a mugshot, a villain you can point at. It simplifies the chaos. It restores the illusion of control. We can't fight entropy, but we can share a poster. Philosophers might call it the moral architecture of spectacle. Sociologists might call it performative justice. But to the average citizen scrolling through the FBI website, it's just instinct, the urge to see, to know, to participate. We've been conditioned to believe that knowing the face of evil is the same as defeating it. It's not, but it feels close enough. And maybe that's why the most wanted list has outlasted every revolution of media. From newspapers to radio, from television to the internet, it keeps adapting, quietly reaffirming its creed. We protect you by showing you what to fear. Hoover's original sin, equating exposure with safety, has become the backbone of modern governance. Transparency no longer means accountability. It means performance. There's also a cruel elegance to how the list interacts with time. Every fugitive's face is a snapshot of the era's paranoia. The 1950s mugshots were stiff, formal, almost cinematic. The 1970s photos were grainy, like evidence from a bad dream. Today's digital profiles are crisp, emotionless, algorithmically enhanced. Each reflects not just technology, but psychology. We've gone from fearing rebels with guns to fearing people who might not exist outside data. And through it all, the Bureau's voice stays calm, clinical, unchanging. Wanted by the FBI. No emotion, no context. Just an invitation to participate in an eternal hunt. That phrase, wanted by the FBI, is more than a tagline. It's a philosophical statement about desire itself. To be wanted is to be acknowledged. The hunted are elevated by the very act of being pursued. Their names become immortal in the pantheon of infamy, while the rest of us scroll by, safely anonymous. The Bureau creates its own pantheon of necessary devils, ensuring the story never runs out of characters. In the end, the Most Wanted list is America's longest-running story about itself. A reflection of its confidence and its insecurity, its order and its chaos, its heroes and its hypocrites. It tells the world, we are strong enough to chase our demons and proud enough to keep them on display. But beneath the performance lies a quieter truth. The Most Wanted list was never about 10 people. It was about one nation, a nation that built its sense of safety not on peace, but on pursuit. And pursuit, after all, is the one thing America never learned how to stop. The Most Wanted list didn't just redefine law enforcement. It rewrote the world's relationship with fear, visibility, and fame. What began as a domestic project of control became a global language. Every country, every intelligence agency, every digital platform that curates a feed of threats or enemies owes a silent debt to Hoover's blueprint. The list turned the concept of justice into a spectacle so efficient, so emotionally addictive, that it transcended its own purpose. It stopped being a tool. It became a story. The genius of the Most Wanted list isn't its accuracy, it's its narrative economy. 10 faces, 10 warnings, infinite reassurance. It doesn't matter that most Americans couldn't name even one fugitive currently on it. The list doesn't demand attention. It assumes reverence. It exists as background mythology, like the Pledge of Allegiance or the flag itself. You don't need to engage with it consciously. You just need to know it's there, pulsing quietly in the nation's subconscious. That quiet hum of vigilance became America's most successful export. After 9/11, governments around the world replicated the formula. Britain's Most Wanted terror suspects, Europe's Most Wanted criminals database, Interpol's red notices. Even private corporations adopted similar models for blacklists and watch lists, substituting fugitives for banned users, insurgents for hackers, heretics for influencers. The logic was the same. To name is to neutralize. Visibility, once a weapon against crime, became a form of punishment in itself. But there's something darker beneath that universality. The Most Wanted list taught modern civilization how to moralize technology. It trained entire generations to equate data with danger, exposure with justice, anonymity with guilt. That's the subtle miracle of Hoover's invention. It disguised surveillance as storytelling. Every time we scroll through an online top 10 or most dangerous countdown, we're reenacting the same ritual, consuming fear as narrative comfort. The 21st century turned that ritual into currency. Fame and infamy, once opposites, have merged into a single economy of attention. A fugitive on the Most Wanted list and a celebrity trending on Twitter function almost identically. They both exist through visibility, both depend on the gaze of millions. The system that once punished outlaws now rewards their media presence. Even those who despise the Bureau's tactics can't help but participate by watching, sharing, commenting. In the attention economy, everyone's an accomplice. That irony cuts deep. The Most Wanted list, meant to separate good from evil, has become one of the clearest reflections of their convergence. The faces it displays aren't simply villains, they're avatars in a culture that consumes morality like entertainment. When a fugitive is caught, the public doesn't feel closure, it feels withdrawal. Another season has ended. Time for new content. Psychologists have written about this feedback loop for decades. Exposure breeds obsession. Obsession breeds normalization. The very visibility meant to deter crime often immortalizes it. Dillinger's grin, Bundy's smirk, Bin Laden's stare. These are the faces of infamy that the most wanted list turned into symbols, then into icons. The Bureau may call them enemies, but the culture remembers them as characters. It's easy to condemn that dynamic as moral decay, but it's more complicated than that. Humans have always needed their monsters. Myths require balance, gods and demons, heroes and villains. The Most Wanted list simply updated the pantheon for a modern audience. Its faces aren't mythological, but their function is the same: to give shape to our fear. When the world feels too vast, too abstract, we reduce it to a portrait, a headline, a mugshot. The digital age only amplifies that impulse. Algorithms now perform the same function Hoover once did manually. They decide who deserves to be seen. A viral post is the new wanted poster, a trending hashtag the new bulletin. The infrastructure of visibility that once served the Bureau has been democratized, but the psychology remains authoritarian. The masses choose the targets, but the ritual is identical. Isolate, expose, punish, repeat. Even art has absorbed the logic. The aesthetics of the Most Wanted list, stark backgrounds, frontal lighting, official typography, echo in everything from film posters to protest art. It's the visual shorthand of modern morality, the face as confession. We no longer trust institutions to tell us what's right, but we still trust faces. The Bureau's greatest legacy is not its fugitives, it's its imagery. It taught the world how to frame guilt. Yet, as the years roll on, the question grows louder. Does visibility still mean accountability? Or has exposure become a substitute for justice itself? The Bureau might catch its fugitives, but the larger systems of power, the corrupt, the powerful, the unseen, rarely make the list. The Most Wanted catalogues the visible sins of individuals, not the invisible crimes of institutions. It reassures us that danger is still personal, still photographable, even when it isn't. That selective morality keeps the story running. The list tells us that evil is finite, containable, human. It hides the truth that evil is systemic, algorithmic, diffused through networks of policy and profit. The Bureau's old posters could fit on a wall. Today's crimes couldn't fit on a hard drive. Yet we cling to the old structure because it feels manageable. 10 faces are easier to fear than 10,000 patterns. And that's where the philosophy of the Most Wanted list becomes prophecy. Hoover's legacy anticipated the modern age's paradox, a world that equates exposure with virtue, but can no longer distinguish between spectacle and truth. The Bureau no longer needs to maintain control. Its template has been absorbed into culture itself. Every click, every retweet, every viral manhunt is a reenactment of that original premise. To see is to know is to judge. The FBI's wall of fugitives has become humanity's wall of reflection. Each face, each digital profile, each headline about the world's most wanted is a confession of what we fear, what we value, and what we choose to ignore. The Bureau may have invented the format, but the world perfected it. The list no longer belongs to the government. It belongs to civilization itself. So yes, the Most Wanted list began as a form of justice, but it became something far more enduring, a philosophy disguised as law, a mirror mistaken for protection, and perhaps the purest symbol of our time, the endless pursuit of evil, not to destroy it, but to ensure it never disappears. Because if evil were ever truly gone, we might have to look at ourselves instead. In the age of artificial intelligence, the most wanted list has begun to evolve in ways its creators could never have imagined. The old rules, crime first, pursuit second, exposure third, no longer apply. The Bureau's hunt for fugitives has merged with something colder, more predictive, more mathematical. Hoover's ghost may have written the first chapter in human paranoia, but technology is writing the sequel without him. And this time, the story doesn't wait for crime to happen. It predicts it. Predictive policing, pattern recognition, algorithmic threat assessment. These are the new tools of the modern Bureau, and they make Hoover's era of paper files and telephone wiretaps look quaint. Every movement, every transaction, every post leaves a trace, and those traces feed the machine. The result is an intelligence apparatus capable of building a profile before a suspect even knows they're being watched. The Bureau's mantra has subtly shifted from wanted by the FBI to flagged by the algorithm. On paper, it sounds efficient, safer, faster, cleaner. But beneath the efficiency hums a deep philosophical unease. For the first time in history, the most wanted list doesn't just record human decisions, it amplifies machine bias. What happens when an algorithm starts predicting who might one day belong on the list? When data, not deeds, becomes the threshold for guilt. Already, whispers circulate inside intelligence circles about the Bureau's evolving Priority Watch program, an internal predictive model that compiles profiles based on behavior patterns, social networks, and travel data. It doesn't accuse, it merely observes. But as every historian of power knows, observation is the first step toward judgment. The list that once reacted to crime may soon preempt it. Hoover's list was theatrical. This one is invisible. The implications are enormous. What began as a wall of wanted posters has become a network of probabilities. Every data point, a credit card purchase, a social media post, a border crossing, feeds the same beast. The new most wanted doesn't need faces. It has patterns. It doesn't need mugshots. It has metadata. It doesn't need fear, it manufactures it algorithmically. And yet, we still cling to the comfort of the old format. The FBI continues to publish its digital top 10 as though those 10 faces are still the embodiment of all evil. The ritual endures because the alternative, the idea that danger might be faceless, statistical, or systemic, is too abstract to believe in. We crave villains with eyes and names, even if the real ones exist only as coordinates in a server farm. Philosophers call this anthropomorphized anxiety, our need to humanize what terrifies us. We'd rather imagine a fugitive with a gun than confront an algorithm that predicts which neighborhoods will be policed or whose data will trigger a flag. The Bureau understands this instinct perfectly. It lets the old myth persist, the faces, the posters, the slogan, while the real work happens behind screens we'll never see. This new duality has made the most wanted list more than a tool of law. It's now a metaphor for modern existence. Everyone, in a sense, lives on a watch list. Every digital footprint is a breadcrumb in someone's dataset. Every online search, every GPS ping, every camera glance contributes to a profile that can be summoned, scored, and stored. The list's power no longer lies in its names, it lies in its potential. And that potential is infinite. Even the Bureau's methods of creation have shifted. Where agents once debated which fugitives deserved inclusion, algorithms now help prioritize based on threat probability. Public safety has been quantified. But algorithms don't have ethics, they have objectives. They replicate bias, magnify inequality, and mistake correlation for destiny. A face that fits the pattern may find itself elevated to visibility not because of guilt, but because of resemblance. The digital list may be more precise, but it's no more just. Hoover would have adored it. Control without accountability, data without dissent, surveillance without suspicion, the machine version of his dream. But for the rest of us, it's a nightmare dressed as progress. Culturally, though, the list remains as glamorous as ever. Movies and television have adapted to the algorithmic age. Gone are the gritty gangsters and charismatic conmen. Now we get hackers in dark rooms, rogue agents with encrypted drives, villains who exist only as usernames. The aesthetics have changed, but the moral rhythm hasn't. Find the face, show the chase, restore the illusion of safety. The list is still our favorite myth, because myths don't need to be real to be reassuring. Meanwhile, in the Bureau's vast digital archives, the old most wanted posters have been scanned and stored alongside new AI-enhanced facial composites. Generations of paranoia, all neatly categorized. Dillinger's smirk in grayscale, Bundy's dead stare in Kodachrome, Bin Laden's blurred portrait beside 3D renderings of cyber criminals we'll never meet. It's a museum of human anxiety, curated by code. And somewhere in that archive, deep within secure servers, machine learning models are being trained on those very images. The past teaching the present how to fear more efficiently. The ghosts of yesterday's fugitives helping shape tomorrow's profiles. History looping like data. The most wanted list has always been more about visibility than justice, but in this new age, visibility itself is the currency of power. The Bureau no longer chases the visible criminal, it chases the invisible possibility, and the public, fed on decades of cinematic manhunts, still cheers for the illusion that the system knows best. We've entered an era where danger no longer hides. It's predicted. Where guilt is no longer proven, it's estimated. And the old slogan, wanted by the FBI, may soon evolve into something even more haunting, detected by the system. That's the philosophical endgame of Hoover's invention. A world where the list doesn't wait for evil to reveal itself, because the machine has already decided who fits the pattern. And in that world, none of us are entirely off the list. In the age of prediction, the line between watching and being watched has dissolved completely. The most wanted list was once a wall, one side for the guilty, one side for everyone else. Now it's a circle, and we're all standing inside it. Every keystroke, every search, every casual glance at a camera lens feeds the same network that built the myth of pursuit. Hoover's invention, born in fear, has metastasized into an ecosystem of observation. The hunter and the hunted share the same reflection. That's the irony of progress. The more technology promises safety, the less privacy survives. The most wanted list was supposed to identify danger. Instead, it normalized suspicion. When the Bureau first published its top 10, the message was clear. These are the ones you should fear. Now, the message is quieter, subtler, and far more pervasive. Anyone could be one of them. In today's data economy, the logic of the list has spread far beyond crime. Employers use algorithms to flag risky candidates. Banks analyze spending patterns to forecast fraud. Governments scan travel histories to infer loyalty. It's all the same grammar: profile, predict, prevent. The most wanted list didn't just catch fugitives. It taught the world how to label people. The Bureau's philosophy of vigilance became the blueprint for social order itself. And yet, we still tell ourselves it's for our protection. We still cling to the illusion that being monitored is the same as being safe. It's the ultimate paradox of the modern age. We fear being unseen more than we fear being exposed. The very mechanisms built to capture villains have turned into mirrors that reflect us all. Hoover's old watch list has become civilization's nervous system. The list was once physical, a stack of paper bulletins mailed to precincts, taped to post office walls, printed in newspapers. Now it's conceptual. Every smartphone is a node, every feed a potential bulletin board. The Bureau doesn't need to publish names anymore. The internet does it for them. Entire communities form around decoding security footage, enhancing pixelated images, and guessing suspects' identities before the law ever confirms them. Digital vigilantism is no longer rebellion, it's recreation. This is how myths survive. The Most Wanted list didn't disappear, it went open source. Its language, faces, fear, finality was absorbed into culture until it no longer needed the Bureau's seal to feel legitimate. The public learned to narrate its own paranoia. Hoover wanted eyes everywhere. He got them. The question is whether we can still tell the difference between justice and spectacle. When the Bureau names a fugitive, the statement carries legal weight. When the internet names one, it carries emotional truth, often more powerful, often wrong. The tools of surveillance have become toys of outrage, and the cycle spins faster every year. Someone is accused, screens light up, algorithms amplify, reputations vanish before evidence can catch up. The Most Wanted template, once sacred, has become a cultural reflex. This new reflex reveals something haunting about the human mind. We crave order, but we fear transparency. We demand accountability, yet we worship anonymity. The digital age has made those contradictions visible, and the Most Wanted myth is where they collide. In a society where everyone is both potential observer and potential suspect, morality becomes a function of visibility. The righteous are those who haven't yet been seen doing wrong. That's the quiet horror of modern justice. Innocence is no longer the absence of guilt. It's the absence of exposure. Meanwhile, the Bureau continues its balancing act between transparency and secrecy. Its website remains pristine. 10 names, 10 faces, 10 summaries. The ritual continues, as if the simplicity of the presentation could still contain the complexity of the world. But behind that clean facade lies a universe of data points, biometric scans, predictive models, and probabilistic guesses, all stitched together into what the Bureau calls threat forecasting. The old list was emotional, the new one is statistical. But both share the same purpose: to keep the public looking outward, never inward. The Bureau has no interest in people questioning the system itself. Fear is most useful when it feels specific. As long as evil has a face, we won't ask what it hides behind. That's why the Most Wanted list still matters, not as a tool of law, but as a lens on power. It shows us how institutions turn fear into structure and how easily we participate in our own surveillance. It's a mirror that flatters us by showing us villains while quietly recording our reflections. In a sense, the list succeeded too well. It made vigilance addictive. It made suspicion patriotic. It made visibility a virtue. And now, as algorithms inherit its logic, it threatens to erase the one thing that made justice human: the capacity to doubt. Machines don't question. They calculate. They don't hesitate. They act. The Bureau's descendants won't publish 10 faces. They'll publish probabilities. And when that happens, the idea of being most wanted will lose its meaning entirely. Because in a predictive world, everyone is wanted by someone's algorithm. The future of the most wanted list isn't a wall of mugshots. It's a map of behavior. Every citizen, every keystroke, every late-night purchase will generate a shadow score of potential risk. Some of us will be labeled high risk for reasons we'll never know. Others will disappear into data oblivion, neither innocent nor guilty, just irrelevant. And perhaps that's the final irony. The list that once promised to make America safer now threatens to make it invisible. We've built a world so obsessed with prevention that it's forgotten the meaning of redemption. The Bureau's pursuit of certainty has outlived the need for evidence, and in its shadow we've built our own digital lists, our own miniature systems of suspicion. Friends, followers, favorites, blocked accounts, all variations on the same ancient ritual, deciding who belongs and who doesn't. The most wanted list began as a weapon of justice, became a theater of fear, and has now evolved into a philosophy of control. It no longer asks who did it, it asks who might. It no longer promises protection, it promises prediction. And as long as that promise feels safer than chaos, we'll keep accepting it. Because in the end, the story of the most wanted list is really the story of us. Our need to know, our fear of being known, and our quiet surrender to the idea that someone, somewhere, should always be watching. When the FBI first introduced the 10 most wanted fugitives list in 1950, no one imagined that it would one day inspire a global template for control. But like all powerful ideas, it spread faster than anyone could contain it. What started as an American experiment in public vigilance soon became a worldwide language of fear. The Bureau didn't just export intelligence methods, it exported mythology. It gave the world a new symbol of authority, the face of the fugitive. By the 1960s, other nations began copying the formula. Britain had its most dangerous men. France published Public Enemies of the Republic. Even the Soviet Union, with its obsession for secrecy, quietly maintained its own version, a list of defectors and dissidents, complete with blurred photographs and coded warnings. Everywhere the idea took hold, the moral logic was the same. To name someone was to contain them. Once your face appeared on the wall, your story was no longer your own. It was never just about catching criminals, it was about establishing narrative dominance. The most wanted list became a geopolitical mirror, each nation reflecting its fears in the faces of its chosen enemies. In the United States, the early lists targeted outlaws and gangsters. In post-war Europe, they targeted spies. In dictatorships, they targeted thinkers. The poster was the same. The definition of wanted was all that changed. That flexibility made it irresistible. The format was simple, visual, and moral, a perfect propaganda tool dressed as public service. Governments realized that a most wanted list could do more than inform. It could shape perception. It could define who the people should fear, and by extension, who they should trust. The Bureau had invented not just a method of policing, but a method of storytelling. And as mass media expanded, the story grew louder. In the 1980s and 90s, Interpol introduced its own global database of fugitives, complete with categories for terrorism, organized crime, and human trafficking. It was marketed as an act of cooperation, a shared defense against global threats. But behind the language of unity lay something more strategic, the synchronization of fear. Each nation added its own entries, but the structure was the same. Faces, crimes, aliases, rewards. The most wanted format became universal shorthand for danger. And with every update, the public absorbed the message, The world is dangerous, but someone, somewhere, is managing it. That illusion of order kept governments powerful and citizens compliant. The post-9/11 era elevated this system to a global scale. The United States, through its war on terror, exported the logic of the most wanted list like a doctrine. Suddenly, every region had its version of high-value targets. The Pentagon published kill lists. The CIA curated watch lists. Drones didn't need posters, they had coordinates. The philosophy was the same, only the delivery changed. Technology made the myth invisible. Where Hoover's lists were tangible and finite, the new versions were dynamic, algorithmic, endless. Targets were added and removed with the click of a button, their existence justified by classified intelligence. The world's most wanted could now be deleted as easily as they were named. Justice had become digital vapor. Still, the aesthetics of the old list persisted. Every government announcement, every televised manhunt, every news graphic about terrorism or espionage still echoes Hoover's rhythm. The lineup, the face, the reward. The template works because it's primal. It appeals to something older than politics, the need to see evil organized. But as more nations adopted it, the definition of evil blurred. In some countries, the most wanted list targeted journalists, in others, protesters. In one particularly chilling example, a regime in Southeast Asia published a Cyber Most Wanted campaign featuring activists accused of spreading misinformation. The faces were young, the crimes vague, the penalties severe. The same format that once helped Americans feel safer now served as an instrument of intimidation abroad. And yet, the irony runs deep. Those lists still borrow their moral legitimacy from the FBI's original design. Hoover's framework carries an aura of authority that even his critics can't escape. To mimic the most wanted list is to borrow the aesthetic of justice. The world learned that control doesn't always need guns, it just needs graphics. This international evolution has blurred the moral geography of law enforcement. When everyone uses the same format, the boundaries between justice and propaganda collapse. A fugitive in one country can be a freedom fighter in another. A terrorist in one nation can be a whistleblower in the next. The most wanted list, once a symbol of order, now serves as proof that morality is a matter of jurisdiction. And in this tangled web of names and faces, power thrives. Each government curates its enemies carefully, balancing fear with reassurance. Too few threats, and citizens grow complacent. Too many, and they panic. The list becomes a political instrument calibrated to maintain equilibrium, the illusion that safety is precarious but achievable. The globalized most wanted culture also created something unexpected, a black market of fame. For certain fugitives, appearing on a list became a badge of notoriety. Rebels, hackers, and outlaws wore it as a form of resistance. To be most wanted meant to matter. The system that sought to erase them instead immortalized them. Visibility, once punishment, became power. It's here that the most wanted list reveals its ultimate paradox. Every time a government declares someone dangerous, it also makes them unforgettable. The act of naming grants immortality. The Bureau, in trying to control fear, accidentally taught the world how to manufacture legend. Now, as global surveillance deepens, the most wanted list has become less a catalogue of criminals and more a portrait of civilization's neuroses. Each name is a confession of collective anxiety. Each update, a pulse of paranoia disguised as progress. What began as a poster in a post office has become the planet's most enduring psychological export. The idea that we are safest when someone else tells us whom to fear. When America exported the most wanted list, it didn't just export an idea, it exported a worldview. The template that once hung on post office walls evolved into a global symbol of authority. It was simple, efficient, moral, and most importantly, cinematic. Every government wanted its own version of that power, a curated gallery of villains that justified vigilance and unified its citizens under the banner of fear. But beneath the efficiency lay something more profound, a redefinition of justice itself. The most wanted model turned law enforcement into theater. Every arrest was a headline, every name a character, every capture a finale. The Bureau had taught the world that justice wasn't just something you performed in court, it was something you broadcast. And the more nations adopted this performance, the more the spectacle replaced substance. Diplomacy quickly adapted. International relations began to rely not on shared trust, but on shared enemies. Countries aligned their most wanted narratives to maintain cooperation. One nation's fugitive became another's bargaining chip. A name on the list wasn't merely an accusation, it was a message, an act of political signaling. By publicizing a target, a government declared its moral posture to the world. In this sense, the most wanted list became a soft weapon, as potent as sanctions or treaties. To name someone as dangerous was to frame the moral battlefield. And as long as nations agreed on who to fear, they could postpone the harder question, what they were afraid of becoming. Take the war on terror. The United States' most wanted terrorists list became a diplomatic script. Countries that cooperated in the pursuit of those names received funding, arms, or trade privileges. Those who hesitated were labeled complicit. Fear became currency, and the most wanted framework became the global stock exchange of security. The language of justice was repurposed as leverage. But the deeper effect was cultural. Once the most wanted template was globalized, it began shaping how societies imagined evil. Governments, media, and citizens all participated in the same choreography of outrage and reassurance. A name appeared, a face circulated, a narrative formed. The enemy was human, visible, containable. Complex causes, poverty, extremism, corruption, were reduced to portraits. It made fear digestible, and in that simplicity lay its danger. The system rewarded attention, not accuracy. Every government discovered that the quickest way to gain legitimacy was to produce a villain. When citizens are afraid, they stop asking questions. The list became a shortcut to stability. Show the people who threatens them, and they'll forget who governs them. Some regimes took the logic further. In countries with fragile democracies or authoritarian leanings, the most wanted model was repurposed to target dissent. Activists, journalists, and political opponents found themselves labeled as threats to national security. Their faces appeared on screens with the same gravity once reserved for murderers. The propaganda was seamless because the format was familiar. People had learned to trust the image of the wanted poster. They didn't think to question its intent. The result was a chilling new diplomacy of fear. Nations learned to trade reputations the way they once traded prisoners. To remove someone from a list became a gesture of goodwill. To add someone was a declaration of hostility. Justice had become transactional, a commodity to be negotiated rather than a principle to be upheld. Meanwhile, media played its part, amplifying each government's narrative with global reach. The most wanted format fit perfectly into the attention economy: visual, emotional, easily shareable. Networks aired dramatic countdowns, documentaries romanticized the pursuit, streaming platforms turned fugitives into folklore. The myth of the list had become self-sustaining. Governments fed it, the public consumed it. The spectacle was so constant that few stopped to ask whether it was still real, and yet the world kept watching. The list, replicated across borders, had created a moral ecosystem where every country appeared righteous simply by publishing one. It no longer mattered whether the fugitives were captured. What mattered was that the list existed. Its presence implied vigilance, and vigilance implied virtue. The illusion was perfect. But history has a cruel sense of irony. As technology blurred borders, fugitives began crossing them faster than governments could react. A hacker in Russia could breach a server in California. A fraudster in Nigeria could drain an account in London. The very globalization that made the most wanted myth universal also made it obsolete. The lists stayed national, the crimes went planetary. The Bureau's structure, 10 faces, 10 stories, suddenly felt archaic. The world's villains no longer posed for mugshots. They operated in shadows of code, money, and ideology. Still, the lists persisted, not because they worked, but because they comforted. They gave people something to look at when the real dangers were invisible. And so the lists multiplied, even as their purpose thinned. Interpol, Europol, national police forces, private cybersecurity firms, all maintaining databases of high-risk individuals. It's a paradox of modern governance. The more we claim to know who the bad guys are, the less we understand what evil actually is. The Most Wanted list's final triumph wasn't legal, it was philosophical. It redefined what it means to exist in the public eye. To be named was to be real. To be invisible was to be irrelevant. In a world governed by exposure, obscurity became the new innocence. And that's the quiet power Hoover never foresaw. His list didn't just create heroes and villains. It created the idea that visibility itself is morality. Those who appear on screens, even in infamy, matter more than those who don't. The logic has infected everything from politics to entertainment to social media. Every platform now has its own Most Wanted, its own curated list of who to watch, who to cancel, who to fear. The result is a planet addicted to performance. Governments perform justice, citizens perform outrage, algorithms perform judgment. Everyone is both watcher and watched, hunter and hunted. The Most Wanted list has fulfilled its destiny, not as a legal instrument, but as a moral operating system for the digital world. And perhaps that's why it endures. Because deep down, humanity doesn't want to abolish fear, it wants to organize it. The Bureau gave us the blueprint, the world built the network, and somewhere, in that infinite web of lists, the illusion still breathes, that as long as someone is being hunted, the rest of us are safe. Every nation has its mythology, and for America, the Most Wanted list became one of its most enduring. It began as a government bulletin, but over time it transformed into something far more intimate, a national mirror, a psychological self-portrait painted in mugshots and moral absolutes. The FBI didn't just tell citizens who to fear, it told them who they were. From the moment J. Edgar Hoover conceived the idea, the list was never just about crime. It was about the American identity itself. The conviction that danger was both external and conquerable, that good and evil could be categorized, photographed, and distributed like trading cards. The Bureau's posters were expressions of faith in the system, a promise that law, order, and reason could tame chaos. And that promise resonated because it aligned perfectly with the country's founding myth, that civilization is built by the vigilant few against the wild unknown. In the early decades, that wildness had a face. It was the gangster, the bootlegger, the bank robber. the outlaw archetype that haunted America's Depression-era psyche. These men, defiant and theatrical, embodied both rebellion and punishment. They symbolized what Americans feared but secretly admired: freedom without restraint. The most wanted list became the ritual by which the nation condemned its own reflection. It loved the outlaw's charisma but worshipped the lawman's authority. It wanted both the chase and the capture. By the mid-20th century, the list had evolved alongside the nation's shifting anxieties. As the Cold War spread paranoia like wildfire, the faces changed from criminals to ideologues. Spies, defectors, and saboteurs replaced bank robbers. The poster had become political. Each fugitive was now an avatar of an ideology, and every arrest a small victory in a global morality play. The Bureau wasn't just enforcing laws, it was defining loyalty. This was the genius of the most wanted list. It spoke to the American need for narrative clarity. In a country where freedom often teeters on the edge of chaos, the list offered structure. It reduced the complexities of crime, poverty, and politics into 10 digestible villains. It made fear simple, and simplicity feels safe. But beneath that order lay a contradiction that America could never quite resolve. The same culture that worshipped justice also idolized transgression. The outlaw became an anti-hero, the fugitive a folk legend. From Jesse James to John Dillinger to Whitey Bulger, the faces on the list were both feared and fetishized. Newspapers sold millions by turning them into celebrities. Films romanticized their cunning. Songs mourned their downfall. The Bureau may have hunted them, but America couldn't stop telling their stories. Hoover understood this duality better than anyone. He knew the public needed villains to feel virtuous. Each face on the list reaffirmed a moral hierarchy that kept the system intact. The list didn't just protect citizens, it entertained them. It made justice a spectacle that reaffirmed national innocence. America could project its sins onto its fugitives and cleanse itself with each capture. Over time, that cycle became ritualized. Each generation found new enemies to chase. Communists in the 1950s, radicals in the 1970s, terrorists in the 2000s, hackers in the 2000s and 20s. The most wanted list adapted seamlessly, like a mirror that never stopped reflecting the era's particular brand of paranoia. And through it all, the narrative stayed the same. America was the light. The fugitives were the darkness. The chase was destiny. But something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The list wasn't just reflecting national fears, it was manufacturing them. By constantly updating the faces of danger, the Bureau kept the idea of threat alive. Fear became self-renewing, and vigilance became identity. To be American was to be watchful, alert, aware. The most wanted list was less about who we feared, and more about why we needed to fear at all. That's the quiet brilliance of Hoover's invention. It made paranoia patriotic. The act of watching became a civic duty. And once that logic took hold, it extended far beyond the Bureau. Neighborhood watches, local news broadcasts, see something, say something campaigns, all of them descend from the same psychological root. The most wanted list didn't just shape federal policy, it shaped the American psyche. Even now, decades after Hoover's death, the pattern persists. Every major crisis revives the myth. After 9/11, it was terrorists. After the financial crash, it was corrupt bankers. After the rise of social media, it became hackers and data thieves. Each generation gets its villains, each list its moral update. The only constant is the chase. But if you look closely, the list reveals something unsettling about the American soul. its need to define virtue through opposition. The list doesn't exist without enemies. America, for all its optimism, defines itself by what it resists: tyranny, lawlessness, chaos, corruption. The Most Wanted list is a living index of those fears, proof that identity in the US has always depended on contrast. And maybe that's why it endures. It's not just a tool of justice, it's a cultural compass. When the Bureau updates its list, it's not merely catching criminals, it's reaffirming the myth that America can still tell right from wrong. The names and faces may change, but the narrative remains sacred. The nation of laws still knows who the lawless are. Yet as technology blurs the line between visibility and guilt, that myth grows harder to maintain. The faces on the list are no longer symbols of rebellion. They're reminders of how fragile the boundary between order and chaos has become. Hoover built the list to reassure America that danger could be seen. But the 21st century has taught us that the most dangerous things often can't. And so, the Most Wanted list continues, part justice, part ritual, part performance. It tells the same story America has always told itself, that the frontier never disappeared, it just moved inward. That the chase is what keeps the dream alive. That somewhere out there, someone is wanted, and that means someone somewhere still believes in justice. America's relationship with its Most Wanted list isn't just institutional, it's emotional, cinematic, and oddly comforting. Over decades, it evolved from a government bulletin into something closer to folklore. In the country's collective imagination, the fugitives became symbols, archetypes, recurring characters in an ongoing moral drama. The Bureau may write the script, but the audience has always directed the show. Hollywood, of course, was the first to seize the narrative. From the moment Hoover's list hit the newspapers, the film industry saw its potential. The gangster movies of the 1930s turned outlaws into dark reflections of ambition. The noir thrillers of the 1940s gave us the criminal as philosopher. The FBI dramas of the 1950s transformed agents into mythic heroes, men who brought order to chaos with a badge and a fedora. Each film was propaganda in the shape of entertainment, reinforcing the same moral architecture the Bureau had built. Evil is real, but justice is relentless. Television carried that legacy into the living room. By the 1980s, shows like America's Most Wanted blurred the line between crime-fighting and prime-time drama. Each episode opened with the same rhythm as the Bureau's poster: faces, crimes, and a plea for vigilance. The show didn't just mirror the FBI, it became its voice. Viewers across the nation gathered to participate in the ritual, believing they were helping bring fugitives to justice. Some actually did. Most just watched, their faith renewed with each capture montage. This fusion of justice and entertainment reshaped how Americans processed fear. The Most Wanted list no longer belonged solely to the Bureau. It belonged to the audience. Every episode, every headline, every documentary turned real criminals into symbols of catharsis. Catching them wasn't just about safety, it was about narrative closure. It made chaos feel conquerable. And then came the digital age, where the myth mutated once again. True crime became an industry. Podcasts, YouTube channels, docu-series, entire streaming categories devoted to retelling the same stories in new tones. The Most Wanted list became content. Creators analyzed it, dramatized it, even romanticized it. The fugitives became characters, and the chases became plots. The FBI no longer needed to shape the narrative. The internet did it for them. But in this constant retelling, something essential changed. The boundary between fascination and empathy eroded. The more stories were told, the less human they became. Fugitives turned into tropes: the mastermind, the loner, the ghost, the betrayer. Their real lives disappeared behind archetypes that fed the public's need for structure. In that sense, the most wanted list no longer served as a record of crime. It became a factory of myth. It's a distinctly American alchemy to transform fear into entertainment and entertainment into identity. Every retelling of a manhunt, every reenactment of a capture, reaffirms the same cultural truth: the belief that the system still works, that order still wins, that we still know who the bad guys are. It's the national bedtime story, retold for comfort as much as curiosity. But the longer this story runs, the more it reveals about the storyteller. America's obsession with the most wanted list isn't just about justice, it's about performance. The Bureau performs control, the media performs outrage, the audience performs participation. The line between morality and theatre has blurred until the two are indistinguishable. That's why the list endures. It provides continuity in a world of chaos. When institutions falter, when politics divide, when trust evaporates, the most wanted list remains unchanged. It's an anchor, a familiar ritual that assures people the machinery of justice still hums quietly beneath the noise. 10 faces, 10 names, 10 reasons to believe in order. Even the aesthetics remain untouched. The symmetry, the typography, the authoritative phrasing, all unchanged since the 1950s. That visual language has become sacred. The Bureau doesn't modernize it because it doesn't need to. The design itself carries authority. To alter it would be to tamper with faith. The most wanted poster is America's secular scripture, printed in Helvetica and sealed with a badge. And yet, beneath the reverence lies fatigue. The public's appetite for fear has outpaced the Bureau's ability to deliver meaning. When everything is broadcast, nothing feels sacred. The endless churn of true crime, streaming thrillers, and online outrage has diluted the moral power of the original list. Justice, once mythic, now competes with memes. The FBI's old ritual of naming villains feels almost quaint in an age where every screen already supplies its own. Still, nostalgia keeps the legend alive. Each update to the list sparks a faint echo of that old fascination, a reminder of simpler times when danger felt local, when villains had faces, and when catching them meant something. The most wanted list has survived not because it remains relevant, but because it remains recognizable. It's comfort disguised as vigilance. Perhaps that's the truest measure of its legacy. The Bureau may no longer control the narrative, but the idea it created continues to shape how the nation dreams, fears, and defines itself. Every story of pursuit, every image of a fugitive, every headline about capture traces back to Hoover's old premise. That visibility is justice, and that order depends on having someone to chase. It's an elegant lie, and maybe a necessary one. Because a society without villains loses its sense of purpose. The chase, however symbolic, keeps the system moving. The most wanted list isn't just about who's running, it's about who's watching. And so the myth continues, recycled and remixed, decade after decade. Hoover's list became America's mirror, and America, in turn, became addicted to its reflection. The faces may change, the technology may evolve, but the story never ends. Because as long as there's a list, there's faith. And as long as there's faith, there will always be someone, somewhere, most wanted. Justice, as America tells it, has always needed two ingredients, a hero and a villain. The Most Wanted list perfected that balance. It's not merely a record of fugitives, it's a stage play of morality, a choreography of fear and reassurance. Yet after decades of repetition, the myth begins to creak. The faces change, but the story stays the same, and the audience starts to wonder if the performance still means what it used to. For most of its life, the list has been sold as a triumph of transparency. It promised accountability, a nation so confident in its laws that it would publish its enemies for the world to see. But transparency is a tricky currency. Show something long enough and people stop seeing it. The Most Wanted list, once shocking, now scrolls past like an old commercial for danger. Familiar, predictable, comforting in its consistency. That's the paradox of visibility. What was once revelation becomes wallpaper. When Hoover first pinned those faces to the wall, each one carried weight. These were the men who embodied the edges of civilization. Now, in the blur of 24-hour news cycles and algorithmic feeds, the same ritual barely registers. We live in an era where everything is exposed, so exposure itself has lost its sting. The list's original power, its ability to make evil visible, has been diluted by a culture that never stops looking. And yet, despite its fading immediacy, the Most Wanted list persists. Because beneath its bureaucratic surface, it satisfies something primal. It gives structure to chaos, narrative to anxiety, and moral shape to confusion. Every new fugitive is a placeholder for our collective unease, a symbol we can point to and say, that's the problem. The names may change, the crimes may shift from bullets to bites, but the function is eternal. Simplify fear into a story. That's where the tension between myth and morality sharpens. The Most Wanted list preaches justice, but it operates through desire. We want to believe in pursuit. We want closure, villains, confessions, redemption. But justice isn't tidy. It's messy, bureaucratic, and often cruel. The myth cleans that up. It gives us the chase without the paperwork, the arrest without the trial, the morality without the nuance. It edits life into narrative rhythm, one poster at a time. This is why America still needs its monsters. Monsters simplify. They make morality manageable. The Bureau's list gives every generation its sanctioned set of demons, externalizing guilt and absorbing the country's contradictions. When institutions fail, when trust erodes, the list still offers a sense of control. As long as there's someone out there to catch, we can pretend the system still works. But the cracks are showing. The world has grown too complex for the old binaries. Today's criminals don't live in smoky hideouts. They live in spreadsheets and data streams. The line between predator and profiteer has blurred beyond recognition. Some of the most destructive acts in modern history are committed not with weapons, but with algorithms, and those faces rarely appear on any wall. The Most Wanted list still hunts bodies, while the real crimes hide in code. This gap between myth and reality creates a kind of cultural vertigo. We know the list is outdated, yet we can't let it go. It's ritual comfort, like reciting a prayer we no longer fully believe. We scroll past the posters, nodding at the idea of justice, while secretly wondering whether it's all theatre. Because deep down, we suspect the truth. The system needs its villains more than it needs its victories. And that realization changes the story. Once, the Most Wanted list was a declaration of pursuit. Now, it's an act of reassurance, a symbol that the machinery of justice still hums, even if we no longer hear it. Each poster whispers the same promise. Order still exists. Someone is still keeping watch. The chase still matters. It's a comforting illusion, but it also hides a cost. By clinging to the myth, America risks mistaking visibility for virtue. The more we focus on the faces of fugitives, the less we see the systems that produce them. The Bureau's posters offer clarity, but real justice demands complication. It asks why crime happens, not just who commits it. The list can't answer that question. It isn't designed to. It's designed to soothe. That soothing power explains why the most wanted idea has spread into every corner of modern culture. Social media has its own digital versions: trending offenders, cancel campaigns, public shaming rituals. The moral reflex is identical: expose, denounce, remove. The same dopamine rush Hoover once cultivated through headlines now lives in every outrage cycle online. We've all inherited the list's logic. We just use different fonts. Yet there's a glimmer of redemption in acknowledging the illusion. The most wanted list, for all its theatrics, still represents an aspiration, the belief that evil can be faced, that justice can be visible, that society can define its boundaries. Even if those boundaries are imperfect, the act of naming them remains a kind of moral ritual. The danger lies not in the list's existence, but in forgetting that it's a story we keep telling ourselves because we don't know how to live without it. In that sense, Hoover's creation endures as both caution and confession. It warns us that power always hides behind performance, but it also reminds us that performance can reveal what we value most. We keep making lists because we keep needing meaning. We keep hunting monsters because we're terrified of what we'll see when they're gone. So the most wanted list continues, not as a relic, but as a living myth stitched into America's conscience. It survives not because it's accurate, but because it's useful. It gives chaos a face, fear a name, and justice a rhythm. And as long as those needs exist, the chase will never end. There comes a point in every story of pursuit when the hunter has to look down at the tracks and realize they form a circle. For America, that moment has been coming for decades. The most wanted list, once aimed outward at outlaws, spies, and killers, has begun to point back toward the very culture that created it. The myth of the fugitive, the obsession with control, the addiction to visibility. These are no longer traits of the hunted, they're traits of the nation itself. From the beginning, the list was supposed to define order. It said, "These are the boundaries. These are the ones who threaten us." But as technology, politics, and culture evolved, those boundaries blurred. The moral certainty that powered Hoover's America has dissolved into a fog of relativity. Now, everyone is visible, everyone is watching, and everyone is performing. The Bureau's original question, "Who do we fear?" has become, "Who do we trust?" And in that confusion, the hunter and the hunted have started to resemble each other. The most wanted list is a mirror we can't stop polishing. Every time it's updated, it reflects a different insecurity. In the 1950s, it was lawlessness. In the Cold War, ideology. After 9/11, it was terror. Now, it's chaos itself, the sense that danger no longer follows rules. That's what gives the list its haunting relevance. It adapts not to crime, but to psychology. It doesn't track the evolution of criminals. It tracks the evolution of fear. And fear in America has always been both weapon and currency. Hoover knew that. He understood that a frightened population is a loyal one. But what happens when the fear machine runs too long? When vigilance becomes paranoia? When surveillance becomes identity? That's the world we live in now, a nation that has internalized the logic of the most wanted list so completely that it polices itself voluntarily. Cameras watch the streets, but our phones watch us. Apps log where we go, what we buy, who we love. Social networks reward exposure, punish privacy, and call it connection. We've become willing participants in our own observation, posting updates like digital mugshots, ranking ourselves by likes and followers. The Bureau's dream of total awareness has been achieved, not through force, but through convenience. We volunteered. This is the moment where the myth turns inward. The Bureau once told Americans that danger lived outside, the outlaw, the spy, the terrorist. But the real danger, it turns out, is inside. The systems we built to protect ourselves, the lenses we installed in our own homes, the algorithms we trained to predict our fears. The most wanted list was supposed to make us safer. Instead, it taught us to accept being watched as normal. That's why this story feels different now. The villains have faded into abstraction. There's no face to pin to the wall, no outlaw to chase through the desert. The modern fugitive isn't a person. It's an idea. It's the loss of privacy, the erosion of truth, the quiet dread that justice has become theatre. The most wanted list, once a symbol of clarity, now stands as a relic of a simpler illusion, that evil was something you could see. But if the old myth is collapsing, something new is emerging. People are starting to recognize the mirror. Documentaries, podcasts, and essays now question the list's legacy. They ask whether visibility equals guilt, whether exposure equals justice, whether the line between accountability and voyeurism has finally disappeared. The nation that once chased its enemies now chases answers. It's a humbler pursuit, quieter, but maybe more honest. Even within the FBI, the list's meaning has shifted. Younger agents treat it less like scripture and more like heritage. They respect its symbolism, but recognize its limits. They know that the real work happens in data centers, not post offices, in analysis, not posters, yet they still update the list. Not because it's efficient, but because it's ritual. It's the Bureau's heartbeat, a reminder of its origin story. Every new face added is a prayer whispered to the past. We're still watching. That phrase, "we're still watching," has become America's unofficial motto. It's written in surveillance cameras, echoed in online trackers, embedded in every smartphone. The hunter never sleeps, but neither does the fear. And somewhere in that endless vigilance lies the paradox of modern justice. The act of watching has replaced the act of understanding. Maybe that's the final revelation of Hoover's creation. The most wanted list was never about the 10 names on it. It was about the 10 million eyes reading them. It turned justice into participation, morality into performance. And once the performance began, no one knew how to stop. The hunter became a brand. The watched became content. The myth became self-sustaining. And yet, for all its flaws, there's still something human in the story's persistence. The desire to believe that evil can be found, confronted and overcome, that hasn't vanished. It just wears a different mask now. The same instinct that pinned Dillinger's face to a post office wall is the instinct that drives modern people to share missing person alerts or campaign for justice online. The ritual has evolved, but the yearning is the same, to make sense of chaos, to feel useful in the face of fear. Perhaps that's why the most wanted list endures, not because it's accurate, but because it's emotional. It gives the illusion of control in a world that feels uncontrollable. It tells us that vigilance equals virtue, that watching equals action, that order still has a name. But look closer, and the reflection stares back. The myth we built to chase danger has taught us how to fear ourselves. We're no longer the audience, we're the cast. The most wanted list didn't just catalogue fugitives. It documented the rise of a civilization that forgot where the line between safety and obsession was drawn. And now, as the cameras blink and the algorithms hum, the circle closes. The nation that once prided itself on catching its enemies has finally caught its own reflection, wanted, not for what it's done, but for what it's become. If the most wanted list began as a declaration of control, it ends as a confession of obsession. It tells us less about fugitives and more about ourselves, our need to believe in the clean geometry of guilt and innocence, our addiction to the chase, our comfort in the illusion that justice has a face. What started as 10 mugshots pinned to a wall has become a kind of national diary, each name a reminder of the stories we tell to convince ourselves that order still exists. Every list is a mirror, and America's mirror has always been crowded. Behind every fugitive's portrait lies a reflection of the fears that made it necessary: poverty, ideology, rebellion, chaos. The list is not just about who broke the law, it's about who broke the illusion that the law is enough. The Bureau built it to reassure citizens that danger was being managed, but the longer it's survived, the clearer its real message has become. The list endures because fear endures, and fear, for all its darkness, gives shape to identity. For 75 years, the Most Wanted list has recorded the heartbeat of the American imagination. It tracks not only crime, but belief. The 1950s feared gangsters with guns, the 1970s radicals with pamphlets, the 2000s zealots with planes, the 2020 ghosts in code. Each decade shifts the scenery, but the script stays the same. There is always a frontier, and someone is always crossing it. The Bureau just keeps printing the wanted posters, framing the story so the ending feels inevitable. What makes the myth powerful isn't its accuracy, it's its rhythm. The list moves in loops of anxiety and relief, tension and release. Each capture resets the cycle. When a fugitive is caught, headlines flash, anchors smile, citizens exhale. Then silence. Then the next update, the next name, the next reminder that safety is temporary. The ritual is almost religious. The list gives people something to fear, something to hope for, and something to watch. It's not just bureaucracy, it's liturgy. Yet in the digital age, that liturgy feels increasingly hollow. The new faces on the Bureau's website appear beside mugshots from decades ago, all flattened by the same layout, the same typography, the same promise. 10 criminals, 10 reasons to stay vigilant. But the world outside that frame has changed beyond recognition. The villains we fear now are networks, systems, algorithms. They have no faces, no borders, no posters. The old mythology feels nostalgic, a relic from a time when evil could still be printed. Still, the Bureau maintains the ritual because myths, once born, don't die easily. They adapt. They hide in the folds of new technology, whispering the same comfort in a different language. The Most Wanted list now lives as much in headlines as in data. It feeds social media threads, inspires true crime podcasts, fuels political talking points. It has become a narrative reflex, a way for a fractured culture to remember what unity once felt like. For a few moments after each capture, America agrees on who the bad guy is. And maybe that's why we can't let it go. The list no longer serves law enforcement as efficiently as it once did, but it serves the national psyche perfectly. It gives the country continuity. It reassures people that the rules still exist, even if they're constantly rewritten. It tells us that no matter how confusing the present becomes, there will always be 10 names to organize the chaos. 10 placeholders for everything we fear but can't name. Look closely at those posters, and you'll notice something else. They're portraits of loneliness. Each face, frozen in time, stares back from a void of institutional neutrality. No background, no context, no humanity, just the person and the accusation. The Bureau stripped them of individuality to make them universal. They are not just criminals, they are symbols, everyman avatars of danger. That reduction is both their punishment and their immortality. It's easy to condemn that dehumanization, but it's also what makes the list function. Justice needs simplicity to survive. Complexity breeds doubt, and doubt slows the machine. The most wanted list isn't built to provoke questions, it's built to prevent them. It translates moral uncertainty into administrative order. Each line of text, aliases, height, last known location, is a small act of narrative control. The Bureau writes, and the public believes, but the cracks in belief are widening. Younger generations, raised on algorithms and transparency, don't see the list as sacred anymore. They see it as content, one thread among thousands. Some question its biases, its omissions, its lingering shadows of propaganda. Others repurpose it as art, remixing its aesthetics into commentary about surveillance and fame. The most wanted list, like all myths, has become self-aware. It knows it's being watched too. Perhaps that self-awareness is its final evolution. The Bureau may not admit it, but the list has become less about enforcement and more about reflection. It's a national confession, a record of what frightens us most at any given moment. The faces change, but the pattern stays. And if we trace that pattern long enough, it forms a map of the American psyche, its optimism, its paranoia, its endless need to chase something it can't quite define. There's something hauntingly poetic about that persistence. The list, born of paranoia, ends as a parable. It reminds us that every act of watching is also an act of imagination, that every enemy we create teaches us what we value, and every chase we sustain distracts us from what we fear to confront. The most wanted list began as a weapon of justice and became a mirror of culture, and maybe that's exactly what it was destined to be. Because at the end of every chase, every manhunt, every update, the same truth waits quietly. The monsters we pursue are never as frightening as the need that drives us to keep pursuing them. Every myth, no matter how enduring, reaches a point where it stops being prophecy and becomes memory. The most wanted list has crossed that threshold. What began as a declaration of power now reads like a diary entry from a younger, more certain nation, a record of the years when America still believed that good and evil could be catalogued, numbered, and neatly contained on a wall. Hoover would have called that progress. In his vision, the Bureau's mission was not just to police criminals, but to preserve an idea. That order could be maintained through visibility. To him, the act of naming was the act of control. But time has rewritten his sermon. The names that once defined eras now sit archived on government servers, stripped of urgency, their stories fading into trivia. The Bureau keeps the tradition alive because tradition is safer than silence. The ritual of the list matters even when the list itself has lost its teeth. There's a strange poetry to the way it lingers. Each new update, 10 faces, 10 warnings, feels like a heartbeat refusing to stop. It's no longer about catching anyone, it's about continuity, about proving that someone somewhere is still watching the gates. In a culture where faith in institutions has eroded, the most wanted list endures as the last unbroken ritual of trust. People may doubt politics, news, or justice itself, but they still believe that the Bureau keeps its list and that the list means something. Maybe that's the secret of its survival. The most wanted list isn't really about justice, it's about reassurance. It reminds us that chaos has borders, that evil can be photographed, that even in a world drowning in ambiguity, order can still be printed in bold black type. The faces on the posters aren't just fugitives, they're placeholders for fear. They make the intangible tangible. The act of seeing them is the act of believing that control exists. But belief, like law, is a fragile thing. The 21st century has revealed how easily the machinery of justice can be co-opted by narrative. Every image, every update, every televised arrest becomes part of a performance that says more about the viewer than the viewed. The most wanted list still works, but not as Hoover intended. It functions now as collective therapy, a story that helps us manage our anxiety about a world that refuses to stay simple. In that sense, the list is no longer a weapon of pursuit, but a mirror of perception. It reflects the country's shifting anxieties back at itself. It tells us what kind of danger we need to imagine in order to feel safe. And as long as we need that feeling, the Bureau's old ritual will never die. The irony is that the list's greatest power has never been in the arrests it produced, but in the stories it inspired. From news bulletins to Hollywood thrillers, from tabloid headlines to true crime podcasts, it gave a template for how to frame morality, the chase, the capture, the closure. It taught generations that justice is not a conversation, but a conclusion. That once a face is printed, the verdict is already written. Now, in the soft glow of digital screens, the myth flickers differently. The old posters hang behind glass in museums, yellowed but proud, while the online version updates quietly, almost automatically. 10 faces stare back through a blue-white haze, timeless in their stillness. The Bureau's seal gleams above them like a promise from another era. We're still watching. It's less a warning now than a whisper, a relic humming with the ghosts of certainty. And yet, the story remains strangely comforting. There's dignity in the persistence of ritual, even when its purpose fades. The Most Wanted list reminds us that civilization survives through repetition, through the constant act of naming, remembering, and hoping that vigilance still matters. The posters may have become digital, the crimes more complex, but the instinct behind them is eternal, to mark the boundaries between the known and the unknown, the lawful and the lawless, the watcher and the watched. In the end, that's what the Most Wanted list really chronicles. Not criminals, but belief. It's a time capsule of the American psyche, an archive of every era's fears disguised as fact. Each generation rewrites it in its own image, projecting its insecurities onto the wall and calling them justice. The Bureau might claim authorship, but the real writer is the culture that keeps needing the story told. Perhaps someday the ritual will end. The technology may outgrow it. The myth may lose its audience. But until then, the list will remain. Quiet, steady, strangely human. Because beneath all its institutional polish lies a truth that outlives bureaucracy. People need to believe that someone is watching the horizon, that the frontier, no matter how abstract, still has guardians. That danger, no matter how invisible, still has a name. And so the Bureau will keep printing its names. The world will keep scrolling past them. And somewhere, between the headlines and the silence, the old rhythm will echo one last time. 10 faces, 10 fears, one nation still pretending that justice can be seen. Not because it's true, but because it's necessary. The myth of the Most Wanted list is older than the internet, older than Hoover's pen, older even than the Bureau itself. The idea of writing names to banish fear reaches back to the clay tablets of ancient kings and the walls of medieval cities where portraits of outlaws were nailed beside proclamations of faith. Every society needs its catalogue of the condemned. Every generation redraws the line between belonging and banishment. Hoover simply gave that impulse a logo, a font, and an audience. By the 21st century, the Bureau's list had become both relic and reference point. In a culture that measures itself by visibility, the most wanted list offered a paradox. The highest form of exposure was also the most damning. Fame and infamy became identical twins, raised under different lighting. Every face on the FBI's site was proof that the same machinery capable of creating idols could just as easily produce demons. The Bureau didn't invent that duality, it institutionalized it. Historians sometimes call the 20th century the century of faces. Portrait photography, film, television, social media all revolved around the notion that the image reveals truth. The most wanted list rode that wave perfectly. A photograph wasn't just evidence, it was verdict. To appear on the list was to be defined forever by a frozen instant. That logic seeped into everything else. Mugshots became clickbait, surveillance footage became narrative, and privacy turned into a luxury commodity. The Bureau's philosophy, that exposure equals order, became the unspoken creed of modern life. But America's fixation on the face hides a deeper anxiety, the fear of disappearance. The country that invented the most wanted list also invented celebrity culture. It worships presence, abhors invisibility. To vanish from view feels like death. That's why even infamy seems preferable to obscurity. Hoover's list, in that sense, fulfilled a national craving. It made sure no one could disappear completely. Every fugitive was a story that refused to end, a cautionary echo that kept the machinery of narrative running. In the early years of the digital era, when databases replaced bulletin boards, the Bureau tried to adapt. It built websites, social media accounts, digital archives. The tone grew colder, more corporate, less theatrical. But the ritual remained. Each new upload mimicked the old rhythm: name, crime, photograph, reward. It's strange how something so bureaucratic could feel so spiritual. The list became less about pursuit and more about preservation, the act of updating it a kind of prayer to continuity. Meanwhile, outside Quantico, the world rewrote the rules of exposure. The same culture that once feared being on the list now fears being off it, being forgotten, being irrelevant. Visibility has become virtue. Every user curates their own micro-version of Hoover's wall, favorite accounts, blocked profiles, digital enemies. The moral language is the same. We list to remember, and we remember to matter. That's what makes the most wanted list feel strangely eternal. It no longer defines the country's fears, it defines its habits. Americans scroll, share, react, and judge with the same rhythm the Bureau once used to publish bulletins. Each new outrage becomes a miniature manhunt, complete with confessions, rewards, and public trials in comment sections. The old myth survives because we keep reenacting it. The faces have changed, the hunger hasn't. Some cultural critics argue that the list's endurance proves that the United States never outgrew its frontier mindset. The outlaw and the sheriff still dance inside the national psyche, one giving meaning to the other. The list is the campfire between them, a place where the story repeats until morning. Even when the real outlaws disappear into history, their archetype remains. Hollywood will resurrect them, the news will rename them, and the Bureau will dutifully post 10 more. Others see something softer in its persistence. They say the most wanted list is not a symptom of paranoia, but of longing, the desire for moral clarity in a world addicted to grey. Every poster is a small assertion that right and wrong still exist, that justice can still be illustrated. In an era where truth itself feels negotiable, that simplicity has its own kind of mercy. And maybe that's why, despite the cynicism of modern times, the list still draws quiet reverence. Even people who distrust authority glance at it with a flicker of belief. There's comfort in knowing that someone, somewhere, keeps track. That the chaos of the world can still be alphabetized, filed, and printed in bold. The Bureau's wall of faces might be an illusion, but it's an organized illusion, and that's often enough. The myth has outlived its maker, survived scandals, outlasted revolutions in technology, and adapted to every shift in media. That endurance says less about the Bureau's efficiency than about humanity's need for stories with borders. The Most Wanted list provides a moral geography, a map where evil has coordinates and justice has direction. In a world spinning faster each decade, that map keeps people oriented, even if it points toward an imagined horizon. So the list persists, quiet and rhythmic, like a heartbeat in the background of national consciousness. The 10 names change, the fear reshapes itself, but the ritual remains identical. Hoover's creation became something far larger than he could have envisioned. Not a weapon of law, but a pulse of meaning. Because what the list ultimately chronicles isn't crime, it's continuity. The Most Wanted list, for all its official tone and sharp edges, has always been more than a tool of law enforcement. It's a compass pointing toward a nation's collective psychology. Every entry on that list whispers the same hidden message. This is what we're afraid of today. And as decades turned into centuries, the fears evolved, reflecting not just changing crimes, but shifting values. When Hoover first conceived it, the United States was fresh from war and high on certainty. The enemy was tangible: bank robbers, saboteurs, traitors hiding in plain sight. The Most Wanted list became an easy narrative for a country desperate for moral stability. It turned chaos into a story with heroes and villains, one the newspapers could sell and citizens could rally behind. But somewhere along the way, the narrative stretched beyond the Bureau's control. The public started to see the list not just as protection, but as prophecy, a mirror predicting the next threat before it appeared. That's the dangerous beauty of myth. It grows legs the moment it's believed. The list evolved from a handful of wanted men into an institution of imagination. Each new face was not just a criminal, but a symbol, an avatar for something bigger: corruption, rebellion, madness, fear. Over time, people stopped caring about the individuals on the posters and started reading the pattern instead. They saw the shifting shape of America's anxieties, the Cold War's paranoia, the drug war's chaos, the terror era's dread, and the digital age's invisible crimes. The faces were never the point. They were placeholders for the fear of losing control. That's why even now, when the Bureau updates its online archive, the ritual feels strangely sacred. The names might be unfamiliar, the crimes abstract, but the message remains constant. Someone is out there, and someone else is watching. It's a story old as civilization. The watchers and the watched, the known and the forbidden. What few realize is that the Most Wanted list did more than reflect the culture. It trained it. The Bureau taught generations how to consume morality in headlines, how to equate justice with visibility, how to measure virtue by vigilance. The list became an unconscious template for how modern media narrates everything from celebrity scandals to political feuds. Every viral outrage follows the same arc: accusation, pursuit, exposure, downfall. It's Hoover's structure, just rewritten for clicks instead of columns. And in that rewriting lies a haunting symmetry. The public once looked to the Bureau for names to fear. Now it supplies its own. Social networks churn out digital lists of offenders every day, cancelled celebrities, disgraced officials, viral villains. The new manhunts unfold in real time, and the line between justice and entertainment dissolves completely. The same instinct that pinned mugshots in post offices now fuels hashtags and outrage threads. The tools changed, but the hunger stayed. What happens then when everyone becomes both observer and observed? The answer is what we live now, a society addicted to accountability and terrified of invisibility. The FBI's list feels almost quaint compared to the endless scroll of digital vigilance that defines modern life. We no longer need posters to remind us who's wanted. We curate our own private lists every day. Who's trending? Who's dangerous? Who's next? Yet buried in that chaos is something strangely hopeful. The most wanted list, for all its limitations, represents a belief in justice, even a flawed one. It's a record of a culture that still wants to draw lines between right and wrong, however imperfectly. The list says, we still care. We still believe in the act of naming, the pursuit of truth, the possibility of closure. In a cynical world, that's no small thing. But it's also a cautionary tale. Because when every society keeps its own list of the unwanted, it risks defining itself by exclusion. The Bureau's ritual reminds us how easily morality becomes theatre, how quickly vigilance becomes voyeurism. When a nation spends too long hunting its monsters, it starts to forget why it began the chase in the first place. The line between protection and projection blurs until the whole world becomes one long manhunt for meaning. That's where the story folds back on itself. The most wanted list isn't just America's mirror, it's everyone's. Every culture has its version, from the secret archives of empires to the public walls of the internet. Each list says the same thing. We are afraid. And this is what our fear looks like. But acknowledging that fear, naming it, is also the first step toward understanding it. And maybe that's the quiet redemption buried inside the Bureau's old myth. The posters, the names, the warnings, they're all reminders that even in the midst of paranoia and spectacle, humanity still reaches for order, still believes that chaos can be catalogued, that justice can be pursued. Whether or not the chases end, the act of pursuit remains an affirmation of belief. The most wanted list began as a wall of names and became a philosophy of visibility. It taught a nation that justice isn't a verdict. It's a performance, a repetition of faith in a system that needs to be believed to survive. And though that performance has changed forms, from paper to pixel, from post office to social feed, it still hums with the same rhythm: seek, see, name, repeat. So the Bureau's ritual endures, not because it's flawless, but because it's familiar. It anchors a restless country in a story it can still understand, the eternal chase between what we fear and what we hope to be. The most wanted list remains America's conscience, part truth, part theatre, entirely human. And as the decades roll forward and new faces replace the old, the message will always echo from those digital walls. Justice is watching, and so are we. The story of the most wanted list is the story of how a country learned to narrate itself through its shadows. The faces on that list were never just criminals. They were punctuation marks in the sentence America kept rewriting about itself. Each edition was a declaration. Here's what threatens us now. Each removal was a sigh of relief that the system still worked, or at least could pretend to. By the late 20th century, that ritual of naming had become instinct. The Bureau had created more than a list. It had created a rhythm, a heartbeat of pursuit that synchronized with the pulse of the nation's media. Every broadcast, every front page, every newscast leaned on that same cadence, the image, the crime, the call to action. The Bureau didn't just feed information to the public, it taught the public how to feel. Fear became organized, quantifiable, consumable. That predictability made the list powerful, but it also made it fragile. Myths only survive as long as they surprise. By the 1980s and 90s, the world was changing faster than the narrative could keep up. Crime was no longer the exclusive domain of men with pistols and hideouts. It had become abstract, data theft, white-collar fraud, digital trespass. The new outlaws didn't leave fingerprints on doorknobs, they left them on keyboards. Yet the Bureau's posters remained frozen in time, a mugshot, a height, an alias. The image of danger refused to evolve, even as danger itself went wireless. This disconnect gave the most wanted list a ghostly quality. It was still iconic, still respected, but increasingly symbolic. The fugitives were real, but the pursuit had become metaphor. America's real chase was for control, over information, over identity, over the invisible systems humming beneath its daily life. The Bureau's 10 names became placeholders for a nation's unease about power it could no longer see. The paradox deepened when the internet arrived. The Bureau built a website to host the list, but in doing so, it surrendered part of its mystery. The posters that once felt sacred now looked like any other link. Anyone could scroll past them between celebrity gossip and stock reports. The democratization of information, once the Bureau's ally, had become its rival. Everyone was now both investigator and audience. The chase had gone public. Yet the myth adapted. It always does. The Bureau realized that while technology erodes secrecy, it also amplifies spectacle. Each online update became an event, each arrest a brief digital sensation. The ritual of the most wanted list shifted from permanence to virality. Its power no longer came from endurance, but from frequency, the endless cycle of refresh, repost, replace. That transformation mirrored the broader cultural drift. America no longer sought resolution, it sought motion. The chase itself became the entertainment. The public didn't want the story to end. They wanted it to loop forever, feeding the hunger for new villains, new mysteries, new faces to define the edges of safety. The Bureau's myth had fused with the Internet's metabolism, endless consumption disguised as vigilance. There's irony in how that loop changed the meaning of wanted. Once, to be wanted meant to be hunted, condemned. Now it also means to be seen, to be relevant. The culture that birthed the Bureau's list has turned the same word into aspiration. Everyone wants to be wanted, even if it's for the wrong reasons. The boundary between criminal and celebrity blurred long ago. The difference now lies only in who writes the caption. That irony isn't lost on the Bureau. Within its archives, agents still print the posters, still pin the faces to walls, still read the reports aloud like liturgy. But they know the real audience lives elsewhere. The list's true afterlife plays out in documentaries, podcasts, film dramatizations, stories that turn pursuit into myth, myth into market. The Bureau keeps the tradition alive because the tradition keeps it visible. In the age of algorithms, even justice needs branding. Still, for all the cynicism that surrounds it, the most wanted list remains oddly pure in its essence. Strip away the politics and publicity, and what remains is a simple human gesture, the refusal to let evil vanish unnamed. It's a catalogue of accountability, however imperfect, insisting that wrongdoing leaves a trace. In a world obsessed with anonymity, that insistence still matters. Maybe that's why the list persists, long after its practical utility has faded. It's not about arrests anymore. It's about memory. Every name, every photograph is a record that someone once stood against the grain of law and order, and that the world cared enough to notice. It's an archive of confrontation, a testament to the idea that civilization survives through remembrance as much as enforcement. And that remembrance works both ways. The Bureau may believe it's preserving the record of criminals, but in truth, it's preserving its own reflection. Each entry says as much about the system that posted it as about the person pursued. The most wanted list is the Bureau's diary, written in other people's names. It reveals not only what America fears, but how it chooses to define fear itself. That definition changes with every decade, every crisis, every new frontier, and as the century deepens, the myth grows self-aware. It knows it's being watched as much as it watches. The list, once a symbol of certainty, now reads like a question mark. It asks whether justice still means pursuit or simply the illusion of it, whether the act of naming still protects or merely distracts. It's a haunting question, one the Bureau can't answer and maybe isn't supposed to. The list was never designed to solve fear, only to frame it. That's its genius and its curse. It promises closure but delivers continuity, ensuring that the story always continues. If you listen carefully, the most wanted list doesn't sound like an order being barked from headquarters. It sounds like breathing. Inhale, fear, exhale, control. It's the rhythm of a nation that has convinced itself that danger can be managed through ritual. The Bureau might have started the chant, but everyone picked up the melody. Newspapers, TV anchors, social media feeds, all of them echo the same beat. Here are the faces. Here is what threatens you. Here is proof that we are still watching. That rhythm built a culture. For decades, the public learned to find reassurance in other people's downfall. Every televised capture was a small exorcism, a momentary purification of collective anxiety. The logic was simple. As long as someone else was the villain, the rest of us were safe. But the longer the ritual ran, the thinner that comfort became. The list was supposed to shrink the world's uncertainty. Yet the more names appeared, the larger the fear grew. That's the paradox of surveillance. The closer you look, the more you find. Each discovery breeds 10 more shadows. The Bureau's success became the public's burden. The most wanted list, intended as a firewall against chaos, turned into a mirror that multiplied it. People began to realize that danger was not a list of strangers. It was a condition of being watched. The Bureau could never admit that openly. Its authority depended on the myth that every chase ended with order restored. But order is not the same as peace, and justice is not the same as closure. Behind every poster's tidy summary, height, weight, aliases, lurked the messy reality of motive, circumstance, and consequence. The most wanted list simplified those into symbols because symbols are easier to live with. Complexity doesn't fit on a bulletin board. That simplification became addictive. The public learned to crave clarity the way it once craved entertainment. A single image could stand in for an entire crime, an entire ideology. Hoover had turned storytelling into policy. Even after he was gone, the machinery kept running on habit and nostalgia. Agents updated the database, not just because it worked, but because not doing so would feel like silence. And silence in a system built on vigilance feels like failure. Meanwhile, the world outside the Bureau's walls stopped standing still. Information no longer needed intermediaries. It multiplied on its own. Anyone with a smartphone could now summon 1,000 faces more wanted, more notorious, more immediately visible than the Bureau's 10. The myth had escaped containment. The government's ritual became the public's pastime. Yet the list still mattered, precisely because it felt outdated. In a century obsessed with novelty, the most wanted list offered something radical: permanence. It reminded people that justice, however flawed, is supposed to remember. In a world where attention evaporates, the Bureau still wrote things down. Each entry whispered the same defiance: "We have not forgotten." That defiance carries a melancholy beauty. To maintain the list is to admit that danger never disappears. It only changes shape. The Bureau's ritual doesn't conquer fear, it keeps fear company. And in that companionship lies a strange kind of faith. A belief that the act of watching is itself a form of protection. That awareness, however impotent, still means resistance. But faith, like fear, evolves. Modern audiences no longer look to the Bureau for safety. They look for symbolism. The posters now read like artifacts from an older civilization, etched with the language of certainty in an age allergic to it. They are relics of a time when the line between good and evil seemed bright enough to print. The Bureau preserves that brightness, like a museum preserves fossils, not because the creature still walks the earth, but because it reminds us that it once did. And maybe that's all any myth ever promises: remembrance. The most wanted list began as a practical tool, but survives as cultural scripture, a moral calendar marking the passage of fear. It documents what terrified us enough to name, what enraged us enough to chase, what comforted us enough to believe that chasing mattered. In the quiet offices where those posters are updated, the agents still perform the ritual. They crop the images, check the spellings, type the aliases. Outside, the world spins faster than they can post. Inside, the hum of computers sounds like a rosary being whispered. The old oath remains unspoken, but understood. Keep the watch, even if no one looks back. That's how myths end, not with revelation, but with repetition. The most wanted list will outlive every fugitive because it's no longer about them. It's about the watchers, and the watchers need to keep watching. The Bureau's wall of faces has become a national mirror, reflecting not threat but endurance, the quiet, stubborn belief that civilization can survive as long as someone writes down its fears. And so the ritual continues. 10 faces at a time, 10 reasons to stay alert. 10 reminders that order, like faith, must be renewed daily. The list no longer promises safety, it promises continuity. It tells us that even as the world grows stranger, someone still remembers the script. In the end, that's what the most wanted list has always been, a story that keeps being told, not because it's true, but because it's necessary. A way to turn fear into form, chaos into catalogue, memory into meaning, and as long as that need exists, the Bureau will keep its vigil, printing new faces on old paper, whispering the same refrain into the silence of every century. We are still watching. By now, the most wanted list has become more than a government tool. It's an echo chamber of history itself, whispering the same tune across generations: fear, pursuit, reassurance, repeat. It's not just a document of criminals, but a living artifact of how America processes its reflection. Each new name added is another verse in a song that never quite resolves. The tempo changes with the times, but the refrain stays the same. We are watching. We are still in control. But control, like fame, is a fragile illusion. Somewhere between the post-war certainty of Hoover's era and the frenetic opacity of the digital age, that illusion began to fray. The Bureau still updates its list, but fewer people check it. Its once electric urgency now hums like background static, buried beneath louder crises, climate, politics, pandemics. And yet, there it remains, steady as ever, like a clock that refuses to stop ticking even after the house has emptied. That clock's ticking matters more than people think. The Bureau's list, for all its bureaucracy, was never meant to be exciting. It was meant to be consistent. It was a promise disguised as paperwork. A promise that someone, somewhere, was always awake while the rest of us slept. That idea, that the watch never ends, is what people still cling to, even if they've stopped noticing it. The myth works best when forgotten. Its comfort lives in the assumption, not the reminder. That's the strange beauty of institutions like the Bureau. They don't just protect, they perform. They play the part of stability, long after stability has become theatre. Every time a new name is posted online, it's less about finding that person and more about maintaining the rhythm of reassurance. It says, the system still breathes, the law still has teeth, the hunt still matters. Whether or not anyone believes it anymore is beside the point. In a way, the most wanted list now functions like a national heartbeat monitor. The fugitive changes, the era shifts, the fear mutates, but the pattern remains, and that repetition becomes its own kind of truth. Because the list doesn't lie about its real purpose. It's not there to end crime. It's there to preserve belief. The belief that someone is keeping score. Even as the world's crimes grow more abstract, data breaches instead of bank robberies, cyber sabotage instead of stick-ups, the list continues to frame danger in human form. It needs faces because stories need faces. Without them, the myth collapses into math. The Bureau understands that the image of a single fugitive still carries more emotional power than an entire spreadsheet of numbers. And so the posters remain, defying algorithms with the blunt poetry of portraiture. Inside the Bureau's archives, rows of those portraits line the walls like saints in a secular cathedral. Their eyes follow you. Some belong to people long dead, their cases technically unsolved but spiritually closed. Others belong to fugitives who vanished so completely that they've become legends in law enforcement lore. The agents who walk those halls know that catching them isn't the point anymore. Keeping their names alive is. To forget them would be to let the ritual die. Outside those walls, the list has taken on its own cultural afterlife. It appears in documentaries, references in novels, homages in art installations. It's studied in sociology classes and film schools as both artifact and metaphor. It represents not just America's war on crime, but its endless argument with itself, its yearning to name evil and its failure to ever do so completely. In that contradiction lies the essence of the country, restless, watchful, always halfway between fear and faith. But the most haunting part of the most wanted story isn't what's on the list, it's what's not. The Bureau's ledger doesn't account for the unseen crimes, corruption, exploitation, indifference, systemic decay. Those can't be pinned to a face or captured in a headline. They live in silence, in boardrooms, in code. And maybe that's why the Bureau keeps printing faces. It's easier to hunt ghosts you can see. Still, despite its blind spots, the list persists as a moral compass of sorts, even if its needle spins wildly at times. It reminds us that justice is not a state, but an act, an ongoing attempt to name the darkness without letting it swallow the light. That act, however flawed, gives the myth its staying power. The Bureau's ritual may not always find truth, but it keeps faith in the possibility of truth alive. And so the list endures, not because it's perfect, but because it's human. It embodies our contradictions: order and obsession, vigilance and vanity, truth and performance. It proves that even in an age of overwhelming information, we still crave symbols, stories, and someone to chase. The Bureau's wall of faces may someday vanish from screens, but its echo will remain in every story of pursuit that follows. Because the Most Wanted list was never really about 10 fugitives. It was about us. About our desire to categorize the unknown, to feel safer by naming danger, to find meaning in the act of searching. And as long as humanity keeps running from its own reflection, there will always be another list, another chase, another whisper in the dark. The Bureau will still update its records, the servers will still hum, and the old promise, faint but unbroken, will linger between the lines of every new post. We are still watching. There's a peculiar silence that lives inside every institution that survives too long. It's the sound of habit replacing purpose. The Most Wanted list hums with that silence now, a ritual so ingrained that it no longer needs a reason to exist. It's simply there, like a light left on in an empty room, glowing for no one but itself. The Bureau maintains it because the Bureau must, because the idea of stopping would feel like erasing part of the country's heartbeat. The list no longer dictates the nation's fears, it reflects them, refracted through nostalgia. It's an antique mirror framed in digital code. Every generation gazes into it, half curious, half comforted, seeing not the fugitives, but their own anxieties staring back. In Hoover's time, the reflection was crisp: robbers, spies, gangsters. Today, the reflection is blurred, 1,000 fears colliding: misinformation, mass surveillance, faceless power, invisible crimes. The Bureau still offers the old promise: names, faces, order, but the world has grown too chaotic for neat categories. And yet, that's precisely why the list endures. It represents the illusion that chaos can be managed, that danger can be boxed in 10 rectangles and catalogued by date. It's the bureaucratic version of hope, a faith that the structure itself still holds, even when the reasons beneath it crumble. To the Bureau, the list is continuity. To the public, it's memory. To history, it's theatre. In the quiet of the archives, you can almost feel the ghosts of its past whispering through the paper. Dillinger, Kaczynski, fugitives whose names once echoed across headlines, now reduced to yellowed files and archived clippings. Their crimes may have faded, but the myth they built endures. They gave the list its shape, its rhythm, its aura. The Bureau has never forgotten that it owes its legend to the very people it condemned. The hunter became iconic because the hunted refused to vanish. There's irony in that. The Bureau's myth depends on the existence of the myth it claims to chase. Without fugitives, there's no watchfulness, no narrative, no reason for the system to hum. The Bureau doesn't just pursue outlaws, it manufactures the space in which outlaws can exist. It defines danger, then devotes itself to proving that definition correct. That's the genius and the tragedy of the Most Wanted list. It needs its enemies to stay alive. Still, within that paradox lies something deeply human. The list isn't just an artifact of control, it's an expression of yearning. To name is to understand, to catalogue is to cope. Every name typed into the Bureau's system is a small rebellion against the infinite. It says, we can know this, we can contain it. And maybe that's why, despite its outdated design and fading influence, the list remains sacred to those who keep it. It's not just a record, it's a defense against meaninglessness. Outside the Bureau, the world has turned that ritual into metaphor. The phrase "most wanted" now applies to everything: celebrity rankings, social trends, viral content. It's a badge of desire rather than danger. The irony would make Hoover flinch. His invention, meant to sanctify order, has been repurposed by the chaos he feared. The word "wanted" now celebrates the very hunger for visibility that once terrified him. The fugitive has become the influencer, the manhunt, a marketing strategy. But even as language betrays its origins, the myth remains resilient. Deep down, people still crave the story the list tells, that justice has direction, that evil can be located, that the moral world has coordinates. It's a fragile faith, but it's faith nonetheless. The Bureau's list keeps that candle lit, even as the storm outside howls louder with every passing year. There's something cinematic about it, the way the ritual persists against reason, the way agents still print new posters even as they know few will see them. The list has become a performance of endurance, a slow-motion act of devotion. It doesn't seek applause, it seeks continuity. Each new name entered is a quiet refusal to surrender to entropy. In a culture obsessed with forgetting, the Bureau remembers. And maybe that's why the list deserves its strange immortality. It's not a monument to power, it's a monument to persistence. To the human need to keep track, to keep vigil, to believe that the act of watching matters. The Bureau's oath to protect and serve has evolved into something quieter, sadder, but no less sincere: to remember and record. Someday, the most wanted list may finally end. The digital archive may fade, the domain may expire, the files may become unreadable. But even then, the idea will live on, in stories, in symbols, in the collective imagination of a people who can't stop chasing certainty. The Bureau may have built the list, but humanity wrote the myth. Because at its heart, the most wanted list is not about crime or justice. It's about recognition. To be listed is to be seen. To pursue is to believe that what's lost can still be found. It's the eternal human equation: fear plus faith equals purpose. And as long as purpose exists, so will the list. 10 names, 10 faces, one endless story. The characters will change, the tools will evolve, but the rhythm will stay the same. The Bureau will keep breathing, the watch will continue, and the silence between updates will remain the most honest sound of all. We are still watching. There's a moment near the end of every story where the silence speaks louder than the words. The most wanted list, after 7 decades of names and faces, has reached that silence. It still updates, still breathes, but the hum has changed. It no longer feels like a warning. It feels like a whisper, a confession from an era that believed order could be printed and fear could be contained in ink. The Bureau keeps its vigil, but the world has moved on, chasing ghosts of its own making. The list remains half museum, half mirror. It doesn't just tell us who ran from the law, it tells us what America has been running from all along. In its reflection, you see the outline of every century's paranoia: the outlaw with a pistol, the spy in the shadows, the ideologue with a cause, the hacker in a basement. But beneath each figure lies the same truth: that fear is cyclical, and justice is just the story we tell to give that fear direction. The Bureau was never naive about that. Hoover may have built the list as a weapon of control, but his successors maintain it as a ritual of faith. It's less about the criminals and more about continuity, the idea that someone is still watching, that vigilance still matters even when belief falters. To remove the list now would be to admit that the myth of watchfulness has ended, that the world has grown too fluid for neat boundaries. And no institution, especially one built on memory, survives by conceding that. In its quiet persistence, the most wanted list has transcended its function. It's no longer a call to arms, it's a time capsule. Each name archived within it is a coordinate on the map of America's collective anxiety. It charts the evolution of fear with the precision of a seismograph. Spikes of panic, waves of calm, tremors of uncertainty. Read closely, and you can trace the nation's pulse across the decades. The list has become its own language, spoken not in words but in absences, in the gaps between names. And yet, for all its gravity, there's an ache in it, a human ache. The Bureau's agents, the ones who compile and update those faces, know they're not just preserving law, they're preserving memory. Behind every mugshot is a story half told, a person frozen in the act of being chased. The Bureau doesn't hunt ghosts so much as it catalogues them, refusing to let them disappear entirely. In that way, the list is as much elegy as archive. Outside, the public has long since turned the idea into myth. The phrase "most wanted" lives in pop culture, in art, in irony. It adorns T-shirts, song titles, clickbait headlines. The sacred has become aesthetic, and maybe that's fitting. Every myth, once absorbed by time, becomes decoration, its sharp edges softened into metaphor. The list survives not because it terrifies, but because it fascinates. It's America's last campfire story, retold by every generation in a new dialect. And still, the Bureau watches. The monitors glow in quiet rooms, the faces update, the data refreshes. The process continues, not because it must, but because it's what the Bureau knows how to do. Institutions, like people, cling to purpose. They need repetition to feel real. The most wanted list has become the Bureau's heartbeat, steady, ancient, unrelenting. The names no longer matter, the act of listing does. Somewhere between myth and machinery, meaning still lingers. The list may have lost its original power, but it gained something deeper: endurance. It outlasted the men who built it, the crimes it chronicled, even the moral certainty that birthed it. It endures because it speaks to a fundamental human need, to believe that evil can be seen, that justice can be pursued, that the world, no matter how chaotic, still has structure. It's not just a government document, it's a prayer disguised as procedure. And prayers, unlike policies, don't need to work, they just need to be repeated. So the Bureau keeps repeating. Every new fugitive added, every archived name crossed off, every press release quietly uploaded into the noise of the internet, it all forms part of a ritual that's less about capturing anyone and more about keeping time itself from unraveling. The list isn't a tool of justice anymore. It's a metronome for memory, ticking in the background of a world that forgets too easily. One day, perhaps, the servers will go silent, the faces will fade, the URLs will break, and the world will have moved so far past the old myth that no one will notice when the last update comes. But somewhere, in an archived corner of history, the story will remain. The idea that a nation once believed so deeply in vigilance that it tried to immortalize it. That's the paradox of the most wanted list. It never truly ends. It was never just about pursuit. It was about preservation. It was about a country that feared forgetting more than it feared crime. A country that believed the act of watching, of naming, of remembering, could hold the world together. And maybe, in its own quiet way, it did. So as the years roll forward and the names keep changing, the same promise hums beneath it all, steady, unbroken, eternal. We are still watching.